meaning survives where evidence quietly expires. Ancient tribal whispers guard impossible encounters, sacred boundaries, invisible visitors, forgotten warnings, and living echoes untouched by ordinary logic. Every moment unsettles familiar thought without asking permission. Remain attentive, because each unfolding mystery quietly transforms disbelief into lingering, unforgettable unease before dawn arrives. Cold Atlantic waves strike the rugged cliffs of Newfoundland with a rhythm that has echoed for thousands of years. Dense forests stretch toward quiet rivers, while mist drifts across sheltered coves where campfires once flickered beneath endless stars. Scattered fragments of red ochre still emerge from the soil, silent reminders that these shores were once home to a people whose story remains one of North America's greatest historical mysteries. The Beothuk lived across Newfoundland for centuries, shaping their lives around seasonal movement, fishing, hunting, and careful knowledge of the island's changing landscape. They became known for covering their bodies, tools, and possessions with red ochre, a striking tradition that gave them a distinctive appearance in the eyes of early European visitors. To the Beothuk, however, the pigment likely carried meanings far deeper than decoration, possibly connected to identity, ceremony, and spiritual belief. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, European fishing expeditions began arriving regularly along Newfoundland's coasts. Permanent settlements followed, bringing competition for resources that had sustained indigenous communities for generations. Coastal hunting grounds became increasingly occupied. Valuable salmon rivers were claimed. Encounters between newcomers and the Beothuk often unfolded through misunderstanding, fear, and mutual distrust. Historical records suggest that the Beothuk generally avoided prolonged contact whenever possible. Rather than establishing trade relationships similar to those formed by other indigenous nations, many Beothuk groups withdrew farther into the island's interior. Was this isolation a deliberate strategy for survival? Or had earlier encounters convinced them that distance offered their only protection? The written record, largely preserved by outsiders, offers only fragments. As decades passed, the pressures intensified. Access to food sources became more limited. Introduced diseases may have spread even without direct contact, traveling through networks of people and materials. Violent conflicts occasionally erupted, deepening divisions between communities already struggling against dramatic environmental and social change. One generation inherited challenges greater than the last. Among the most well-known names connected to this history is Shawnee, often described as the last known Beothuk woman. After the deaths of her relatives, she spent her final years sharing memories of her people through drawings and conversations recorded by colonial officials. Those sketches remain invaluable historical documents, preserving glimpses of Beothuk camps, tools, customs, and experiences that might otherwise have vanished completely. Yet, even her testimony raises difficult questions. How much had already been forgotten before anyone thought to listen? The mainstream historical explanation is both tragic and complex. Most scholars point to a combination of disease, displacement, resource competition, violence, and increasing isolation as the primary forces behind the disappearance of the Beothuk as a distinct cultural community during the early 19th century. No single catastrophe ended their story. Instead, numerous hardships accumulated across generations until survival itself became nearly impossible. Still, uncertainty lingers around the edges of that explanation. Local traditions occasionally speak of isolated families retreating into Newfoundland's remote interior, where forests and valleys remained largely unexplored for centuries. Could small groups have survived longer than official records suggest? A handful of unverified accounts describe mysterious camps, unfamiliar tracks, or distant figures glimpsed between the trees before disappearing without a trace. None have been confirmed, yet they continue to circulate among local storytellers. Other theories are even more speculative. Some suggest that surviving Beothuk individuals may have quietly joined neighboring indigenous communities, gradually blending into other populations while preserving fragments of their traditions in ways that escaped written documentation. Others wonder whether archaeological discoveries still waiting beneath layers of earth could transform current understanding of their final generations. Every new excavation has the potential to answer one question while creating several more. If one mystery leaves us searching beneath weathered headstones, the next invites us into a landscape where the earth itself seems reluctant to surrender its secrets. Across the dry mountains of the American Southwest, silence has preserved another legend, one measured not by forgotten names, but by veins of silver that may or may not have existed at all. Jagged ridges rise above endless stretches of desert, their slopes carved by wind, rain, and centuries of relentless sunlight. Narrow canyons twist between towering walls of volcanic rock, while hidden springs appear unexpectedly before vanishing beneath gravel and sand. The terrain offers few landmarks that remain unchanged for long. A storm can reshape a wash overnight. A landslide can erase a trail followed for generations. It is the kind of country where directions slowly become stories. Somewhere within this rugged wilderness, according to one enduring legend, rests the lost Comanche silver mine. The mystery draws together several strands of documented history. Spanish explorers and missionaries traveled extensively through the Southwest beginning in the 16th century, searching for mineral wealth as well as new settlements. Rich silver deposits were discovered throughout northern Mexico and parts of what is now the United States, encouraging countless expeditions into unfamiliar territory. Many mines prospered for decades before being exhausted, abandoned, or simply forgotten. The Comanche emerged centuries later as one of the most influential indigenous nations of the Southern Plains. Renowned for their horsemanship and mobility, they controlled vast regions through trade, diplomacy, and military strength. Their familiarity with the landscape was extraordinary. They knew seasonal water sources, mountain crossings, sheltered valleys, and routes invisible to outsiders. That intimate knowledge eventually became intertwined with stories of a hidden source of remarkable silver. One version of the legend suggests that Spanish miners discovered an exceptionally rich deposit deep within isolated mountains. Before the location could become widely known, conflict forced them to abandon the operation. The surviving miners either concealed the entrance or died before revealing its whereabouts. Another tradition proposes that the Comanche themselves knew where valuable ore could be found, but deliberately protected the location, recognizing that such knowledge would attract an endless stream of outsiders seeking wealth. Neither version has been conclusively proven. Historians generally approach the legend with caution. Records from frontier regions were often incomplete, and many expeditions left only fragmented journals or unofficial reports. Place names changed over time, while natural landmarks described in centuries-old documents gradually disappeared through erosion. A canyon, identified in one account, may no longer resemble its original description, making historical reconstruction remarkably difficult. Even so, the story refused to fade. Throughout the 19th century, prospectors crossed deserts carrying faded maps copied from older manuscripts. Some believed they possessed directions passed down through Spanish families. Others relied on stories shared in isolated settlements, where local traditions blurred the distinction between history and folklore. Every unusual rock formation became a possible marker. Every abandoned shaft inspired fresh speculation. Occasionally, explorers returned claiming they had found evidence. Pieces of unusually rich silver-bearing ore were reportedly collected from remote valleys, only for the discoverers to lose the exact location during their return journey. Skeptics attribute these accounts to exhaustion, dehydration, or simple miscalculation in difficult terrain. Yet, supporters of the legend ask why similar experiences appeared in so many separate narratives across different generations. The geography itself encourages uncertainty. Desert mountains are deceptive. Distances shimmer beneath waves of heat. Identical ridges repeat across the horizon, while winding arroyos create natural mazes that challenge even experienced travelers. Modern satellite imagery has reduced many of these difficulties, but it has not eliminated them entirely. Certain valleys remain surprisingly isolated, visited only occasionally by hikers, ranchers, or geologists. As technology advanced, expectations grew that the mystery would finally be solved. Geological surveys mapped extensive mineral formations throughout the region. Aircraft photographed mountain ranges once considered inaccessible. More recently, digital elevation models and satellite analysis have revealed forgotten trails and abandoned mining sites hidden beneath vegetation. Yet, despite these advances, no location has gained universal acceptance as the legendary lost Comanche silver mine. Beyond conventional explanations, more speculative ideas continue to circulate. Some storytellers suggest the entrance was intentionally collapsed and disguised, leaving no visible trace. Others believe repeated earthquakes or centuries of erosion sealed the mine beneath tons of rock. A few accounts describe strange lights appearing near isolated cliffs or unexplained echoes resembling distant metal striking stone. Such reports remain unverified, and natural explanations, from unusual geological acoustics to atmospheric conditions, have been proposed. Even so, they have become part of the legend's enduring atmosphere. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the silver still lies hidden beneath the mountains, but why the story continues to inspire new searches after so many years. Every generation arrives with better maps, improved tools, and greater confidence, yet the landscape offers only silence in return. Somewhere beyond the familiar trails, beneath weathered stone and shifting desert winds, the lost Comanche silver mine remains suspended between documented history and enduring folklore, leaving one quiet possibility behind. Perhaps the land has chosen to keep its richest secret a little longer. Just as the desert can conceal a forgotten mine beneath layers of stone, history can conceal something even more elusive, a final resting place. Not every mystery is hidden by distance. Some endure because the past itself refuses to settle, leaving behind questions that echo long after the people who lived them are gone. Morning light spreads gently across the quiet hills of Fort Sill in present-day Oklahoma. Rows of aging gravestones emerge through drifting mist, their inscriptions softened by more than a century of wind and rain. Old oak trees cast long shadows over the Apache prisoner of war cemetery, where silence feels less like emptiness and more like remembrance. Among these graves stands a monument associated with one of the most recognized Native American leaders in history, Geronimo. For many visitors, the monument appears to answer an important question. It marks the place where Geronimo is believed to have been laid to rest after his death in 1909. Yet, for others, the stone represents something entirely different. It is not the end of a story, but the beginning of one. Geronimo, a leader of the Badonkoghe Apache, spent decades resisting both Mexican and United States military campaigns that pushed into Apache homelands. His reputation for determination spread far beyond the Southwest, making him one of the most recognizable indigenous figures of the 19th century. Following his surrender in 1886, he remained a prisoner of war for the rest of his life, eventually living at Fort Sill under military supervision. Historical documents describe his final years with surprising detail. He raised livestock, sold handmade items to visitors, participated in public events, and dictated parts of his life story to those willing to record it. Despite these moments of adaptation, accounts from people who knew him suggest that he never stopped longing for the mountains and valleys where he had once lived freely. After falling ill during the winter of 1909, Geronimo died from pneumonia. Military records state that he was buried in the Apache prisoner of war cemetery, where a monument still stands today. Most historians accept these records as reliable. Contemporary newspaper reports and official documents largely support the account of his burial. Yet, over time, another story emerged. According to a long-standing legend, members of the secret society Skull and Bones, some of whom were reportedly stationed at Fort Sill during military training in the early 20th century, entered the cemetery and secretly removed Geronimo's skull. The story gained wider attention decades later when a letter surfaced describing what appeared to be such an event. Whether the letter documented an actual incident, exaggerated a campus tradition, or simply reflected rumor has never been conclusively established. The allegation has never been proven. No verified forensic evidence confirms that Geronimo's grave was disturbed. Even so, the claim has continued to attract attention because it exists in an unusual space between documented history and persistent folklore. Some researchers note that cemeteries of that era were not always maintained as carefully as they are today. Grave markers could deteriorate. Burial records occasionally contained inconsistencies, and security was often minimal. Such conditions make speculation easier, even when firm evidence remains absent. Others argue that the legend follows a familiar historical pattern. Famous individuals often become surrounded by stories involving stolen relics, hidden tombs, or secret organizations. As years pass, these stories can become increasingly difficult to separate from documented fact, especially when surviving witnesses are no longer alive to confirm or deny them. The mystery gained renewed public attention in 2009, the centennial of Geronimo's death, when descendants sought legal action requesting the return of any remains if they had indeed been taken. The case did not establish that the alleged removal had occurred, nor did it uncover definitive new evidence. Instead, it highlighted how unresolved the question had remained for generations. Beyond the legal debates lies a deeper cultural significance. For many Apache people, the importance of a burial place extends beyond physical remains. It represents ancestry, identity, memory, and an enduring connection between generations. Even the possibility that such a resting place might have been disturbed carries profound emotional and spiritual weight. Today, visitors who stand before Geronimo's monument often encounter only stillness. Wind passes gently through the surrounding trees. Birds move quietly among the stones. Nothing in the peaceful landscape reveals whether the grave has remained untouched for more than a century or whether part of its story has yet to be uncovered. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the monument marks Geronimo's true resting place, but whether history has preserved every chapter of his final journey. Somewhere within forgotten archives, overlooked testimony, or memories passed quietly through generations, another piece of the story may still exist, waiting for the moment when silence finally gives way to understanding. If Geronimo's final resting place reminds us how easily history can become uncertain, the mountains that once sheltered his people reveal another kind of mystery, one not hidden beneath stone markers, but concealed within an immense wilderness where maps have never told the whole story. The Sierra Madre stretches across northern Mexico like an endless maze of ridges, pine forests, steep ravines, and towering cliffs. From above, the landscape appears almost without pattern. Deep canyons divide mountain ranges into isolated worlds, while narrow passes disappear beneath thick vegetation and broken rock. Even today, many valleys remain difficult to reach, accessible only after long journeys through rugged terrain. It is a landscape that naturally guards its secrets. For generations, these mountains served as both refuge and homeland for Apache groups who understood every spring, canyon, and hidden trail. Long before modern roads crossed the region, knowledge of the Sierra Madre was passed from one generation to the next through experience rather than maps. A narrow path concealed beneath trees, or a spring hidden within a rocky gorge, could determine whether a family survived another season. During the 19th century, as military campaigns intensified across the American Southwest and northern Mexico, many Apache bands retreated into the Sierra Madre. Leaders, such as Geronimo and others, relied upon the mountains not merely as hiding places, but as carefully chosen defensive landscapes. Small groups could move quickly through terrain that larger military forces struggled to navigate. Soldiers often entered unfamiliar valleys only to discover that those they pursued had vanished without leaving obvious traces. Historical accounts confirm that Apache strongholds existed throughout the Sierra Madre. Temporary camps, lookout points, concealed trails, and naturally protected canyons allowed families to remain remarkably difficult to locate. United States and Mexican military reports repeatedly describe exhausting expeditions through mountains where supplies dwindled, guides became uncertain, and familiar landmarks disappeared into endless ridges. Yet, among these documented refuges, one legend has endured above the rest. According to regional traditions, somewhere deep within the Sierra Madre lies a particularly secluded Apache stronghold, a place so carefully concealed that outsiders never fully identified its location. Some descriptions portray it as a vast natural fortress surrounded by sheer cliffs. Others speak of hidden valleys containing reliable water, sheltered campsites, and multiple escape routes known only to those raised within the mountains. Whether such a single location ever existed remains uncertain. Many historians suggest that the legend likely emerged from several different Apache camps, gradually blending together through oral tradition. Rather than relying on one permanent fortress, Apache communities were highly mobile, adapting to changing conditions and avoiding predictable patterns. In this view, the lost stronghold represents a symbolic memory of many refuges rather than one forgotten place. Even so, certain historical records encourage continued speculation. Military officers occasionally reported pursuing Apache groups into remote mountain regions only to lose every trace of them within hours. Scouts familiar with surrounding terrain sometimes admitted that they could not explain how entire families disappeared so completely. Were hidden trails responsible? Carefully concealed shelters? Or simply generations of unmatched environmental knowledge that outsiders never fully understood? The geography certainly allows for remarkable concealment. The Sierra Madre contains thousands of square miles of broken terrain, much of it marked by cliffs, caves, dense forests, and winding canyons. Seasonal weather transforms the landscape throughout the year. Heavy rains reshape streambeds, rockfalls alter narrow passes, and vegetation slowly reclaims abandoned camps. Places once occupied can vanish beneath nature within only a few decades. Over time, more speculative stories began to circulate. Some explorers described stumbling upon unusually level clearings surrounded by stone walls that appeared almost intentional before realizing they could no longer relocate the site. Others reported discovering ancient fire rings, fragments of tools, or carefully stacked rocks in locations so remote that their presence seemed difficult to explain. Archaeologists caution that isolated discoveries rarely reveal a complete story, and many such reports remain undocumented or impossible to verify. Still, they continue to inspire curiosity. Local traditions add another layer to the mystery. Some speak of valleys where echoes behave strangely, making distant voices seem unexpectedly close while concealing nearby movement. Others describe hidden springs that reveal themselves only during certain seasons or after periods of heavy rain. Practical explanations exist for many of these observations, shaped by geology, acoustics, and climate. Yet, within the broader legend, they contribute to the enduring impression that the mountains possess a character all their own. Modern technology has transformed exploration of remote landscapes. Satellite imagery, aerial surveys, and digital mapping have revealed forgotten trails, abandoned settlements, and archaeological sites that earlier generations could scarcely imagine finding. Even so, vast portions of the Sierra Madre remain only lightly studied. Dense vegetation, difficult access, and the sheer scale of the region continue to challenge researchers. Perhaps that is why the legend has survived. It is not simply the story of a hidden refuge, but of a landscape that has never fully surrendered its memories. Somewhere among those endless ridges, beyond familiar paths and overlooked canyons, traces of the Apache world may still rest undisturbed, waiting quietly beneath the forests, where the mountains continue to keep their oldest secrets. If the Sierra Madre reminds us that landscapes can preserve secrets for centuries, the next mystery suggests that people can carry them even longer. Sometimes, the greatest puzzles are not hidden beneath mountains or forests, but within stories repeated so often that the boundary between memory and legend becomes almost impossible to recognize. The Missouri River moves steadily across the northern plains, reflecting broad skies that seem to stretch without end. Cottonwood trees line its banks, while rolling grasslands fade into the distant horizon. Long before modern towns appeared, this river connected communities through trade, travel, and shared traditions. Among those communities was the Mandan Nation, whose Earth Lodge villages stood along these fertile waterways, becoming important centers of commerce and diplomacy for generations. Early European visitors often remarked upon the Mandan with particular curiosity. Their villages were well organized, their agricultural knowledge was extensive, and their position along the Missouri made them familiar with travelers arriving from many different regions. Detailed journals described their architecture, ceremonies, and daily life, leaving behind some of the earliest written observations of the northern plains. Yet, alongside those careful descriptions, emerged an unexpected claim. Beginning in the 18th century, several explorers and writers suggested that the Mandan might possess distant connections to Wales. The idea eventually became known as the Mandan Welsh tradition, a theory proposing that medieval Welsh voyagers had reached North America centuries before Christopher Columbus, and that their descendants survived among the Mandan people. The story itself reaches even further into the past. According to Welsh tradition, Prince Madog supposedly sailed west across the Atlantic during the 12th century after leaving Wales because of a succession dispute. Some versions of the legend claim he discovered an unknown land and established a settlement before returning to gather additional colonists. If such a voyage truly occurred, its destination has never been confirmed. Over time, speculation expanded, and some writers proposed that the mysterious settlement eventually became connected to the Mandan. What inspired such an extraordinary conclusion? Part of the answer lies in early descriptions written by European observers. A handful of visitors commented that certain Mandan individuals possessed lighter complexions or hair colors than they expected. Others believed aspects of Mandan society appeared unusually familiar when compared with European customs. Reports also circulated claiming that isolated words spoken by the Mandan resembled the Welsh language. These observations attracted considerable attention, particularly during an era when explorers searched eagerly for evidence supporting legendary voyages across the Atlantic. Modern scholarship, however, approaches these claims with considerable caution. Linguists who have carefully studied the Mandan language have found no persuasive evidence of a historical relationship with Welsh. The language belongs to the Siouan family and follows patterns consistent with neighboring indigenous languages rather than medieval Welsh. Similarly, archaeologists have uncovered no verified artifacts linking the Mandan to a Welsh colony dating to the 12th century. Physical appearance has also received more careful examination. Human populations naturally display a wide range of features, and isolated descriptions recorded by early travelers are not considered reliable evidence of ancestry. Lighting, artistic interpretation, personal expectation, and cultural misunderstanding frequently shaped the observations preserved in historical journals. Even so, the legend endured. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, explorers occasionally arrived among the Mandan hoping to discover proof of Prince Madoc's lost colony. Some attempted conversations using Welsh words. Others searched villages for European objects or architectural features they believed might support the tradition. None produced evidence that convinced the broader scholarly community, yet each expedition added another chapter to the growing story. There is another possibility worth considering. Rather than revealing a forgotten medieval voyage, the legend may reflect the hopes and assumptions of those who created it. During periods of exploration, many Europeans sought familiar connections within unfamiliar landscapes. Legends such as Prince Madoc's voyage offered a comforting narrative, suggesting that their ancestors had reached distant continents long before official history acknowledged them. In this sense, the Mandan Welsh tradition may reveal as much about the imaginations of later storytellers as it does about the Mandan themselves. Still, certain questions remain surprisingly resilient. Could a small, undocumented Atlantic voyage have occurred centuries before Columbus without leaving clear archaeological evidence? Historians generally regard such a possibility as highly unlikely, yet not every episode of human exploration survives in written records. Across history, countless journeys have vanished entirely, remembered only through fragments of oral tradition or scattered references whose meanings remain uncertain. Meanwhile, the Mandan themselves experienced profound changes during the 19th century. Epidemics, particularly the devastating smallpox outbreak of 1837, dramatically reduced their population and transformed their communities. With so much cultural knowledge disrupted, many earlier traditions became more difficult to reconstruct in complete detail. Although this tragedy does not support the Welsh theory, it reminds us how easily historical understanding can become incomplete when entire generations are lost. Today, the quiet banks of the Missouri continue to flow past places where Mandan villages once stood. The river carries no answers about Prince Madoc, forgotten voyages, or distant connections across the Atlantic. Instead, it preserves a quieter lesson. Some mysteries endure not because evidence continues to grow, but because imagination fills the spaces where certainty ends. Whether the Mandan Welsh tradition represents misunderstood observation, hopeful legend, or a question history has already answered, it remains a fascinating reminder that every story leaves behind another path still waiting to be explored. Some mysteries survive through forgotten maps and uncertain journeys. Others remain because the land itself holds memories that cannot be easily translated into words. From the flowing waters of the Missouri River, the search for lost connections now moves westward, toward a landscape where mountains, traditions, and unanswered questions have been intertwined for generations. The Black Hills rise from the surrounding plains of South Dakota like an island of stone and forest. Their dark peaks stand apart from the open grasslands, covered with pine forests, hidden valleys, and streams that cut through ancient rock formations. Long before modern boundaries were drawn, this region held deep spiritual meaning for the Lakota and other indigenous peoples who regarded the Black Hills as a sacred landscape, connected to creation, ceremony, and ancestral memory. Within these mountains and valleys, stories have endured of hidden treasures, objects of spiritual importance, lost possessions, and valuable materials believed to have disappeared into the wilderness. Some are connected to historical events. Others exist within oral traditions passed through generations. Together, they form a collection of mysteries surrounding what has been called the lost sacred Black Hills treasures. The idea of hidden wealth in the Black Hills is not without historical foundation. The region has long attracted attention because of its natural resources. Gold was discovered there in the 19th century, leading to a major rush of settlers and prospectors despite the area being recognized through treaties as belonging to the Lakota. The arrival of miners transformed the landscape and created conflicts that shaped the history of the American West. But the treasures associated with the Black Hills are not limited to gold. Many traditional accounts speak of sacred objects carried through generations, items connected to ceremonies, leadership, and spiritual responsibilities. These objects were never considered ordinary possessions. Their importance came from their relationship to identity, community, and the unseen forces believed to connect people with the natural world. Some legends describe valuable items hidden away during periods of conflict, when communities were forced to move or protect important belongings from outsiders. According to these stories, certain objects may have been placed in caves, valleys, or remote locations where only a few individuals knew their location. Over time, knowledge of those hiding places may have disappeared. Could these stories represent actual hidden caches? Or are they symbolic memories of a time when protecting cultural treasures became necessary for survival? Historians and researchers approach such accounts carefully. Many indigenous traditions were passed orally rather than through written documents, meaning details could change as stories traveled through generations. At the same time, oral histories often preserve information about places, events, and experiences that written records may overlook. The challenge lies in understanding these accounts within their own cultural context, rather than measuring them only against conventional expectations. Beyond sacred objects, another layer of mystery surrounds rumored lost gold deposits and forgotten mining sites throughout the Black Hills. During the Gold Rush era, countless prospectors searched the region, and not every discovery was properly recorded. Some miners disappeared. Some abandoned claims. Others left behind vague references to promising locations that were never found again. Over the years, explorers have searched for hidden tunnels, abandoned mines, and forgotten campsites. Some have claimed to find unusual rock formations, old tools, or signs of past activity deep within isolated areas. Yet, many discoveries remain difficult to date, and few provide clear evidence connected to any specific legend. More speculative stories suggest that hidden treasures may remain untouched because the locations were intentionally protected. Some believe ancient caves or secluded valleys still contain objects placed there during times of upheaval. Others wonder whether the greatest treasure is not something made of gold or precious materials, but knowledge itself, stories, ceremonies, and traditions preserved despite centuries of change. Modern technology has revealed much about the Black Hills. Geological surveys, archaeological research, and satellite mapping continue to uncover new information about the region's past. Yet, the landscape remains vast, and many areas are difficult to study because of terrain, environmental concerns, and the cultural importance of certain locations. Perhaps that is why the legends continue. The Black Hills are not simply a place where people search for something lost. They are a place where memory, history, and mystery exist together. Beneath the forests and stone ridges may rest forgotten artifacts, undiscovered archaeologic. The Black Hills are not simply a place where people search for something lost. They are a place where memory, history, and mystery exist together. Beneath the forests and stone ridges may rest forgotten artifacts, undiscovered archaeological evidence, or simply the echoes of stories whose meanings have traveled farther than any object could. As the winds move through the pine-covered peaks and the shadows stretch across ancient valleys, the question remains, are the lost sacred Black Hills treasures waiting somewhere within the landscape? Or does their true value exist in the stories that have survived long after their origins disappeared? The Black Hills remind us that some mysteries are preserved by landscapes themselves, where memory remains attached to rivers, forests, and mountains. But other mysteries survive through the traces left behind by people who lived quietly at the edge of a changing world. Far west of those ancient peaks, among the rugged valleys of Northern California, another story waits, a story of survival, isolation, and a hidden refuge that remained unknown for generations. The foothills surrounding the Sacramento Valley rise gradually into a landscape of oak woodlands, rocky ridges, and narrow canyons shaped by seasonal rivers. In these remote areas, the terrain can appear almost untouched, with dense vegetation concealing pathways that were once familiar only to those who knew the land intimately. Beneath the shade of ancient trees and along forgotten creek beds, traces of earlier lives still remain, fragments of tools, abandoned campsites, and places where communities once adapted to the rhythms of nature. This was the homeland of the Yahi, a small group of the Yana people who lived in what is now Northern California. For thousands of years, the Yahi developed a deep understanding of their environment. They gathered plants, hunted game, shaped tools, and maintained traditions connected to the forests and waterways around them. Their world changed dramatically during the 19th century as settlers moved into California, bringing conflict, disease, and rapid transformation to indigenous communities throughout the region. The California Gold Rush accelerated these changes. As newcomers arrived in search of wealth, indigenous populations faced violence, displacement, and the destruction of traditional resources. Many native communities experienced catastrophic losses during this period, and the Yahi were among those whose numbers declined severely. Yet, a small group survived by withdrawing into one of the most difficult landscapes to reach. For decades, the Yahi remained hidden from the outside world. They avoided settlements, traveled quietly through remote areas, and preserved their way of life away from growing towns and expanding farms. Their ability to remain unseen for so long became one of the most remarkable survival stories in California history. How could a group of people remain concealed for nearly 40 years while surrounded by a rapidly changing society? Part of the answer lies in the landscape itself. The rugged canyons and thick forests of the region created natural barriers. The Yahi possessed generations of knowledge about seasonal movement, hidden water sources, and locations where they could live without drawing attention. What outsiders viewed as wilderness was, to the Yahi, a familiar and carefully understood homeland. In 1908, a group of surveyors unexpectedly encountered evidence of the hidden community. They discovered a small settlement containing shelters, tools, and other belongings. The encounter revealed that a handful of Yahi people had survived far longer than many outsiders believed possible. Several years later, in 1911, a lone Yahi man entered the town of Oroville, California. He was eventually identified as Ishi, a name given to him by researchers because his traditional name was never spoken publicly according to Yahi custom. He became known as the last widely recognized survivor of the Yahi people. Ishi's life after his discovery remains a complex and deeply studied chapter of indigenous history. He spent much of his later years at the Museum of the University of California, where researchers recorded his knowledge of language, tools, hunting techniques, and cultural practices. These records became invaluable because so much Yahi knowledge had already been lost. Yet his story also raises difficult questions. Was Ishi truly the last Yahi person? Historical accounts suggest that other members of his group had died shortly before his arrival in Oroville, but the details remain incomplete. Could there have been others who survived but remained hidden? Were there additional families who chose isolation rather than contact with the outside world? Such possibilities have been discussed, though no evidence has confirmed the survival of other Yahi communities beyond those already documented. The hidden refuge of the Yahi represents more than a physical location. It reflects the remarkable ability of a people to maintain identity despite overwhelming pressure to disappear. It also reveals how much history can remain unknown when entire communities are pushed beyond the reach of written records. Today, the exact places where the Yahi lived in isolation are approached with respect and caution. Some locations remain protected, preserving the memory of those who endured there. Archaeological research continues to examine evidence from the region, offering new understanding while also reminding researchers of the limits of what can be recovered. The forests and canyons of Northern California still hold many unanswered questions. Somewhere among those quiet valleys may be traces of forgotten camps, hidden pathways, and stories never recorded. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not where the Yahi refuge existed, but how much of their world remained unseen before the outside world finally discovered it. The story of the Yahi reminds us that some mysteries are preserved through silence, hidden away in landscapes where survival depended on remaining unseen. But other mysteries are created during moments of conflict, when people are forced to move quickly, leaving behind objects, supplies, and pieces of their lives that may never be recovered. Among the mountains and valleys of the American Northwest, one such mystery follows the path of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. The high valleys of present-day Idaho and Montana stretch beneath wide skies, surrounded by steep mountains, rushing rivers, and forests that once served as both homeland and refuge. Trails wind through canyons where generations of the Nez Perce traveled for hunting, trade, and seasonal movement. To an unfamiliar observer, these landscapes appear vast and empty. To the Nez Perce, they were filled with memory, meaning, and knowledge passed through countless generations. Within this rugged terrain lies a lingering question connected to one of the most dramatic episodes of indigenous resistance in North American history. What happened to the hidden belongings, weapons, and valuables carried by Chief Joseph's band during their desperate flight of 1877? Chief Joseph, known in his own language as Hinmatu Ya Lut Kekt, became one of the most recognized leaders of the Nez Perce during their conflict with the United States government. His name became associated with a remarkable retreat covering more than 1,000 miles as Nez Perce families attempted to reach safety after being forced from their homeland in the Wallowa Valley. The journey was not a military campaign alone. Entire families traveled together, carrying supplies, horses, weapons, personal belongings, and items connected to their daily lives. They crossed rivers, mountain passes, and unfamiliar territories while being pursued by the United States Army. The movement became a struggle for survival under extreme conditions. After the final battle at Bear Paw Mountain in Montana, Chief Joseph and his followers surrendered in October 1877. The famous words attributed to him reflected the exhaustion and tragedy of the moment, the realization that continued resistance was no longer possible. But surrender did not mean every possession had been recovered. During the retreat, Nez Perce groups were constantly forced to make difficult decisions. Supplies became heavy burdens, horses were lost, equipment was abandoned, valuable objects may have been buried, hidden, or left behind as the group moved through dangerous territory. Over time, stories emerged of a hidden cache containing weapons, personal items, or other belongings connected to the journey. Could these hidden items still exist somewhere beneath the forests and mountains? Historical evidence confirms that abandoned campsites and discarded materials were common during military campaigns of the 19th century. Archaeological discoveries from conflict sites have revealed tools, ammunition, and personal objects left behind by those who had little choice but to move quickly. In that sense, the possibility of forgotten Nez Perce belongings remaining in remote locations is not impossible. Yet, the specific legend of Chief Joseph's hidden war cache remains difficult to verify. Some accounts suggest that members of the Nez Perce concealed supplies before battles, hoping they could return later. Others propose that valuable items were hidden after surrender to prevent them from being taken by soldiers or outsiders. In certain versions of the story, the cache contains objects of great material value. In others, the importance lies not in wealth, but in the personal connection these items hold to a defining moment in Nez Perce history. Researchers approach these stories carefully. Oral traditions often preserve memories of important events, but details can shift as they pass through generations. A hidden cache may represent a specific location, a collection of scattered belongings, or even a symbolic memory of everything lost during the forced migration. The landscape itself adds another layer of uncertainty. Rivers change course. Forests grow over old trails. Landslides reshape mountainsides. A location described by one generation may become almost impossible for another to identify. Even experienced explorers can struggle to match historical descriptions with modern terrain. Over the years, treasure hunters and history enthusiasts have searched areas connected to the Nez Perce retreat. Some have reported finding old cartridges, tools, and fragments that suggest past activity. However, individual discoveries rarely provide enough evidence to confirm a connection to Chief Joseph's final journey. Perhaps the true mystery is not simply whether a hidden cache exists, but what it represents. The lost objects of the Nez Perce would not merely be artifacts from a conflict. They would be fragments of a story about displacement, endurance, and a people's determination to protect their identity during one of the most difficult periods of their history. Today, the mountains and valleys crossed by Chief Joseph's band remain quiet. Rivers continue to flow through the same landscapes where families once traveled under the threat of pursuit. Somewhere within those forests and ridges, forgotten traces of that journey may still remain, waiting beneath the earth, preserved by time, and raising the same question that has followed the legend for generations: what was left behind and what might still be hidden. The hidden traces of Chief Joseph's journey remind us that entire worlds can disappear without leaving behind clear answers. Sometimes, what is lost is a single object carried through a difficult escape. Other times, what vanishes is far greater: a city, a homeland, and the memory of a civilization that once shaped an entire coastline. Along the warm waters of southwestern Florida, where mangrove forests weave through shallow bays and islands rise from the Gulf of Mexico, the landscape appears almost unchanged by time. Tidal channels move slowly between the trees. Birds cross the open skies above quiet waterways. Beneath this peaceful environment, however, lie the remains of one of the most remarkable indigenous societies ever encountered by early European explorers, the Calusa. At the center of their world stood a powerful settlement often described as the Calusa capital, located on what is now known as Mound Key in Estero Bay. Unlike cities built from stone, this center was shaped from earth, shells, and human effort. Massive shell mounds rose above the surrounding waters, creating platforms for homes, ceremonial spaces, and places of authority. From a distance, these formations appeared to be natural islands. In reality, they represented generations of construction. The Calusa were unlike many other indigenous societies in North America. They developed a complex coastal civilization based not on large-scale agriculture, but on their extraordinary knowledge of the marine environment. They harvested fish, shellfish, and other resources from the Gulf waters, creating a society supported by the abundance of the sea. When Spanish explorers arrived in Florida during the 16th century, they encountered a powerful kingdom unlike anything they expected. Early accounts describe the Calusa ruler as a figure of great influence, commanding respect from surrounding communities and controlling extensive territories throughout southwestern Florida. The capital was not simply a village. It was the heart of a political and spiritual network. Spanish records describe impressive structures, including large buildings capable of holding hundreds of people. Leaders met with foreign visitors there. Ceremonies took place within its elevated spaces. The settlement represented the power and organization of a civilization that had developed over many centuries. Yet, within only a few hundred years, this remarkable center faded from view. What happened to the Calusa capital? The conventional explanation is a combination of forces that devastated indigenous communities throughout Florida. European contact introduced diseases to which native populations had little resistance. Conflicts with Spanish colonists and rival groups created further instability. By the 18th century, the Calusa population had declined dramatically, and many survivors had moved away or joined other communities. Environmental changes also played a role. Coastal landscapes are constantly transformed by storms, rising waters, erosion, and shifting shorelines. A settlement built from shells and earth was vulnerable to the same forces that had once shaped its creation. But the disappearance of the Calusa capital has continued to inspire questions. Archaeologists have studied Mound Key and other nearby sites for decades, uncovering evidence of construction techniques, daily life, and ceremonial activity. Excavations have revealed that the mounds were carefully engineered, containing layers of shells, bones, pottery fragments, and other materials deposited over generations. Still, many details remain incomplete. How did the Calusa organize such a complex society without relying heavily on farming? How large was their capital at its height? And how much of their world disappeared before outsiders truly understood what they had encountered? Some local stories and speculative theories suggest that additional Calusa settlements may remain hidden beneath coastal waters or buried beneath vegetation on nearby islands. Given the constant transformation of Florida's coastline, researchers acknowledge that undiscovered sites are possible. However, there is no confirmed evidence of a lost city comparable to the legends that have grown around the Calusa capital. The mystery is also connected to the way history is recorded. Much of what is known about the Calusa comes from Spanish accounts written by outsiders. These documents provide valuable information, but they also reflect the perspectives and assumptions of those encountering a culture they did not fully understand. The voices of the Calusa themselves survive mainly through archaeology, making every artifact an important fragment of a much larger story. Today, Mound Key remains a quiet reminder of a civilization that once dominated the waters of southern Florida. The mangroves continue to surround the ancient mounds. The tides continue their endless movement. Beneath layers of shell and soil may still rest evidence of ceremonies, forgotten structures, and stories never recorded. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether the Calusa capital truly vanished, but how much of it remains waiting to be discovered. Somewhere beneath the changing landscape of Florida's coast, pieces of this lost world may still survive, silently asking what other chapters of the past have yet to be uncovered. The story of the Calusa reminds us that entire societies can disappear beneath the slow movements of nature and time. Yet, the remains of some civilizations vanish in another way, not beneath the ocean or shifting landscapes, but through conflict, migration, and the gradual fading of memory. Along the rivers and forests of the eastern woodlands, another powerful indigenous nation left behind a mystery of lost settlements and forgotten strongholds. The Susquehanna River moves through the valleys of present-day Pennsylvania and Maryland, winding between forested hills and open farmland. Its waters have connected communities for thousands of years, carrying stories, trade, and traditions along a landscape shaped by countless generations. Hidden among these valleys are traces of a people who once controlled a vast region and built fortified settlements that impressed early European visitors. They were the Susquehannock. Known for their imposing presence and powerful alliances, the Susquehannock were one of the most influential indigenous nations in the mid-Atlantic region during the 17th century. European explorers described them as tall, skilled warriors with large villages protected by defensive structures. Their territory stretched along the Susquehanna River, where they controlled important trade routes connecting the interior forests with coastal settlements. Among their most remarkable features were their fortified towns. Early accounts describe settlements surrounded by wooden palisades, designed not only for protection, but also as centers of community life. These strongholds contained homes, storage areas, and gathering spaces where families lived through periods of both peace and conflict. To European observers arriving from distant lands, these settlements appeared unusual and sometimes unexpected, challenging assumptions about indigenous societies in North America. But the world of the Susquehannock changed rapidly. The arrival of European powers transformed existing networks of trade, diplomacy, and competition. New diseases spread through indigenous communities, reducing populations that had no previous exposure to them. The introduction of firearms altered warfare. Alliances shifted as different groups attempted to survive in an increasingly unstable environment. By the late 17th century, the Susquehannock faced devastating pressures. Conflicts with neighboring nations, including the Haudenosaunee, weakened their position. Violence and political instability forced many survivors to abandon traditional settlements and seek protection elsewhere. Eventually, the Susquehannock population declined dramatically, and their once powerful towns disappeared from the landscape. Yet, the exact locations and stories of some of their strongholds remain uncertain. Archaeologists have identified several Susquehannock sites through pottery, tools, defensive structures, and other remains. These discoveries provide important evidence of their way of life. However, historical records are incomplete, and many early descriptions provide only general locations rather than precise maps. Could some of their fortified settlements still remain undiscovered? The possibility is not impossible. Forest growth, erosion, agricultural changes, and expanding development have transformed much of the region over centuries. A wooden palisade that once stood clearly above the landscape could leave behind only subtle traces, unusual soil patterns, scattered artifacts, or fragments buried beneath layers of earth. Some local traditions speak of forgotten Susquehannock villages hidden in remote valleys, where traces of ancient walls or abandoned camps may still exist. These accounts are difficult to verify, but they reflect a broader reality. Indigenous settlements were often larger and more complex than early written records suggested. More speculative stories have suggested that certain strongholds may have contained hidden caches of weapons, ceremonial objects, or personal belongings left behind during periods of sudden departure. While there is no confirmed evidence of such discoveries, the idea continues to capture imagination because it reflects a common pattern throughout history. Communities forced to leave behind pieces of their lives during moments of crisis. The mystery surrounding the Susquehannock is also a reminder of how much historical knowledge depends on surviving records. Much of what is known comes from European observers who viewed these communities through their own cultural perspective. The voices of the Susquehannock themselves survive primarily through archaeology and traditions preserved by later generations. Today, the valleys once occupied by the Susquehannock appear peaceful. Rivers continue to move through the same landscapes where fortified villages once stood. Forests cover hillsides that may have witnessed gatherings, conflicts, and decisions that shape the fate of an entire people. Somewhere beneath those fields and forests, evidence of forgotten strongholds may still remain. Perhaps future discoveries will reveal more about these vanished settlements, the people who built them, and the final days of a nation that once dominated the Susquehanna Valley. Until then, the question remains: how many traces of the Susquehannock world are still waiting quietly beneath the surface, hidden from modern eyes? The vanished strongholds of the Susquehannock reveal how quickly a powerful society can fade from the landscape, leaving behind fragments of pottery, scattered memories, and unanswered questions. But some mysteries are not defined by abandoned villages alone. They are shaped by the disappearance of an entire people whose final chapters remain uncertain. Along the forests, rivers, and fertile lands of the Great Lakes region, another story unfolds: the mystery of the neutral nation and the fate of those who survived their collapse. The landscape of southern Ontario and western New York is marked by quiet rivers, dense woodlands, and rich farmland stretching across the region once known as neutral territory. Beneath the modern landscape lie traces of a world that existed before. Written borders divided the land. Archaeological sites reveal villages, burial areas, tools, and fragments of daily life belonging to a people who built communities connected by agriculture, trade, and diplomacy. They were known as the Neutral Nation, or Atawandaron, by neighboring indigenous peoples. During the 17th century, the Neutral occupied a strategic position between powerful nations of the Great Lakes. Their territory stretched across what is now southern Ontario, particularly around the Niagara Peninsula and areas west of Lake Ontario. Their name came from their reputation for avoiding direct involvement in conflicts between neighboring groups, especially the long-standing tensions between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Wendat. But neutrality did not guarantee safety. The arrival of Europeans transformed the balance of power across the Great Lakes. New trade relationships emerged, particularly involving valuable resources such as fur. European goods changed economic systems that had existed for generations. More devastatingly, diseases introduced through contact with outsiders spread through indigenous communities, causing severe population losses. By the middle of the 17th century, the Neutral faced increasing pressure from conflicts that reached far beyond their own territory. The Beaver Wars, a series of conflicts involving control of trade networks and resources, brought instability throughout the region. The Haudenosaunee expanded their military campaigns westward, while weakened indigenous nations struggled to survive amid changing alliances and declining populations. Historical records indicate that around the 1650s, the Neutral Nation suffered devastating attacks. Their villages were destroyed, many people were killed, and survivors were scattered. After this period, the Neutral largely disappeared from written European records as a distinct political and cultural group. But what happened to those who survived? This question remains one of the most intriguing aspects of their history. The most widely accepted explanation is that surviving Neutral people joined neighboring indigenous communities. Some may have integrated with the Haudenosaunee, while others may have joined the Wendat or other Anishinaabe-speaking nations. In this view, the Neutral did not vanish completely. Instead, their identity transformed as survivors adapted to a world that had changed dramatically. Yet, the details of this transition remain difficult to reconstruct. How many people survived the destruction of their villages? Where did they travel? Which communities carry pieces of their heritage today? Archaeology provides important clues. Excavations of Neutral villages have revealed evidence of agricultural practices, longhouses, trade networks, and interactions with European visitors. Objects recovered from these sites demonstrate a society deeply connected to the wider Great Lakes world. However, archaeology often reveals how people lived more clearly than what happened after they left. Some researchers have explored the possibility that small groups of neutral survivors remained in their traditional homeland longer than historical records suggest. The forests and valleys of the region provided many places where isolated families could continue living beyond the attention of colonial authorities. Given the limitations of 17th century documentation, could some communities have survived quietly for generations? There is no confirmed evidence of a hidden neutral settlement continuing into later centuries. However, the possibility reflects a broader challenge in indigenous history. Absence from written records does not always mean absence from existence. Many communities experienced disruption so severe that colonial documents captured only fragments of their story. The landscape itself adds to the mystery. Many neutral villages were built from materials that naturally disappear over time. Wooden structures decay. Fields return to forests. Paths are covered by soil and vegetation. Without archaeological investigation, a settlement that once supported hundreds of people may leave only subtle traces behind. Occasionally, local stories describe unusual discoveries in the region, artifacts found by farmers, stone tools uncovered near rivers, or traces of old settlements hidden beneath modern development. Archaeologists evaluate such discoveries carefully, since objects can move through trade networks and may not always indicate where a community lived. Still, each discovery contributes another piece to a puzzle that remains incomplete. More speculative theories have suggested that some neutral survivors may have traveled much farther than historians currently recognize, becoming part of distant communities whose connections were never recorded. Such ideas are difficult to prove, but they reflect a fundamental truth about human movement. People displaced by conflict often travel along routes that leave little evidence behind. The story of the neutral nation is not only about disappearance. It is about adaptation. It is about how communities respond when their world changes beyond recognition. It is about the challenge of tracing people whose lives were interrupted before their own voices could be fully recorded. Today, the lands once occupied by the neutral remain filled with reminders of their presence. Rivers continue flowing past ancient village sites. Forests cover areas where homes and gathering places once stood. Beneath the surface, archaeologists continue finding evidence of a society that was far more complex than early records often suggested. The fate of the neutral survivors may never be known in complete detail. Perhaps their descendants carry traditions that have not yet been fully connected to the past. Perhaps future archaeological discoveries will reveal forgotten chapters of their journey. Or perhaps the final movements of the neutral people will remain one of history's quiet mysteries, preserved only in fragments beneath the soil and in the memories of those who came after them. Somewhere within the Great Lakes landscape, traces of their story may still be waiting to be found. The fate of the neutral nation reminds us that disappearance does not always mean an ending. Sometimes a people's story continues quietly through descendants, traditions, and fragments left behind in the landscape. Across the vast grasslands of the southern plains, another mystery emerges, one surrounding a civilization whose settlements once stretched across the prairie, yet whose greatest communities gradually faded from view. The wide plains of present-day Kansas and surrounding regions appear almost endless beneath the open sky. Tall grasses move with the wind, rivers cut through fertile valleys, and distant horizons seem unchanged from one season to the next. Yet beneath these quiet fields lie traces of a remarkable society that built some of the largest indigenous settlements ever recorded in the Central Plains. These were the communities of the Wichita people. Long before European maps divided the region, Wichita villages existed as thriving centers of agriculture, trade, and social life. Their settlements were not temporary camps scattered across the prairie, but carefully organized communities containing hundreds of grass-covered homes, cultivated fields, ceremonial spaces, and gathering areas. To early explorers arriving from Europe, the scale and organization of these villages challenged many assumptions about indigenous life on the Great Plains. Among the most significant sites was the large settlement near the Arkansas River known today as the Etzanoa site in southern Kansas. Early Spanish explorers encountered this community during the 16th century, describing a settlement so extensive that thousands of people may have lived there. The exact appearance of the village has been reconstructed through archaeology, but many details of daily life remain incomplete. What happened to these great settlements? The answer is not a single event, but a gradual transformation shaped by forces that affected indigenous societies throughout North America. The Wichita built their communities around farming, especially crops such as corn, beans, and squash. They also hunted bison and maintained extensive trade networks connecting the plains with neighboring regions. Their location allowed them to exchange goods, ideas, and technologies across a vast area. European contact introduced dramatic changes. Spanish expeditions entered Wichita territory during the 16th and 17th centuries, bringing new materials as well as new pressures. Later, expanding trade networks altered regional relationships. Horses transformed transportation and hunting practices. Firearms changed conflicts between neighboring groups. Diseases introduced through contact with outsiders reduced populations that had no previous exposure to them. By the 18th century, many large Wichita settlements had declined or moved. Historical explanations suggest several overlapping causes. Environmental changes may have affected agriculture and access to resources. Increasing conflicts with neighboring nations created insecurity. European colonial expansion disrupted established trade systems. Together, these pressures encouraged Wichita communities to relocate and reorganize. Yet, the disappearance of their great settlements continues to raise questions. Were these villages abandoned completely, or did they transform into smaller communities that simply became harder for outsiders to recognize? Archaeological research suggests the second possibility. The Wichita people did not vanish. Their descendants remain connected to the Wichita and affiliated tribes today. However, the massive village centers that once dominated the landscape became less visible over time, leaving behind a mystery about how such impressive communities could fade so completely from public memory. The landscape itself contributed to the disappearance. Unlike stone cities that survive for thousands of years, Wichita homes were built primarily from natural materials. Wooden supports decayed. Grass coverings returned to the earth. Fields were reclaimed by vegetation. Over centuries, a settlement that once held thousands of people could become almost invisible without careful investigation. Modern archaeology has revealed just how much was hidden beneath ordinary-looking terrain. Excavations have uncovered house patterns, pottery fragments, tools, trade objects, and evidence of agricultural activity. These discoveries show a society with remarkable organization and long-distance connections. Yet, each discovery also creates new questions. How large were these settlements at their peak? How were they governed? What ceremonies took place within their central spaces? Some legends and local traditions have suggested that additional Wichita settlements remain undiscovered beneath farmland and prairie. Given the enormous size of the plains and the difficulty of locating sites without visible structures, archaeologists acknowledge that many areas remain insufficiently studied. New discoveries continue to change understanding of the region's indigenous past. More speculative interpretations have imagined lost cities hidden beneath the grasslands, suggesting that forgotten Wichita communities may have been far larger or more complex than historical records reveal. While such ideas often extend beyond available evidence, they reflect a genuine curiosity about how much remains unknown beneath landscapes that appear familiar. Perhaps the most fascinating mystery is not whether the Wichita built extraordinary settlements, they clearly did, but why those achievements were overlooked for so long. Early outsiders often misunderstood plains societies, assuming mobility meant simplicity. Archaeology has shown a different picture. Communities capable of engineering large villages, managing agriculture, maintaining trade networks, and adapting to changing conditions over centuries. Today, the winds still move across the same plains where Wichita homes once stood. Rivers continue following ancient paths. Beneath fields and open grasslands, traces of forgotten villages remain preserved, waiting for careful study. The great Wichita settlements are not truly lost, but many chapters of their story remain incomplete. Somewhere beneath the surface may still be evidence of overlooked communities, forgotten traditions, and moments of history that have yet to be understood. The question remains: how much of this vanished world is still waiting quietly beneath the prairie, hidden not by distance, but by time itself? The great Wichita settlements reveal how entire worlds can disappear from view while their foundations remain beneath the landscape. Across the southern plains, traces of villages, ceremonies, and forgotten generations continue to emerge from the soil. Yet farther east, among the forests and waterways of the American Southeast, another mystery waits, one connected not to vanished cities, but to sacred places where spiritual power, leadership, and treasured objects were once gathered. The landscape of the Caddo homeland stretches across parts of present-day eastern Texas, western Louisiana, southern Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Here, rivers move slowly through wooded valleys, fertile fields extend beneath wide skies, and ancient earthworks rise gently above the surrounding terrain. These mounds may appear like ordinary hills at first glance, but many were carefully constructed by generations of Caddo people for ceremonial, political, and spiritual purposes. Within these sacred landscapes existed some of the most sophisticated indigenous societies in North America. The Caddo were not a single settlement or village, but a network of related communities connected through language, trade, ceremony, and shared traditions. Their ancestors built large ceremonial centers featuring earthen mounds, plazas, and structures that served as places of gathering and spiritual activity. Long before European explorers arrived, these communities developed complex systems of leadership and exchange across a wide region. Among the most mysterious aspects of Caddo history are stories surrounding lost temple treasures, objects believed to have been associated with sacred buildings, spiritual leaders, and ceremonial traditions. What exactly happened to these treasures remains uncertain. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that Caddo communities created remarkable objects from materials such as pottery, shells, copper, stone, and other resources obtained through extensive trade networks. Some items carried deep ceremonial meaning, representing connections between humans, ancestors, and the spiritual world. Early European explorers who entered Caddo territory recorded encounters with powerful leaders and impressive ceremonial structures. Spanish expeditions during the 16th and 17th centuries described large villages, organized communities, and respected religious figures. They also brought new forces that would eventually transform Caddo society. Disease, conflict, and colonial expansion changed the region dramatically. Epidemics reduced populations. Trade networks shifted. Political structures adapted to new pressures. As communities relocated or reorganized, many ceremonial places were abandoned, leaving behind questions about what happened to the objects once kept within them. Were sacred items buried for protection? Were they carried away by people leaving their ancestral lands? Or do some still remain hidden beneath the earth? The idea of lost Caddo treasures has grown from several historical realities. Indigenous communities throughout North America often protected important objects during times of danger. Items connected to ceremonies were sometimes placed in secure locations, buried, or moved to new settlements. In a changing world marked by conflict and displacement, preserving cultural objects could become a matter of survival. Archaeology provides evidence that many important artifacts remain undiscovered. Caddo sites continue to reveal new information about architecture, trade, and ceremonial practices. However, the exact locations of many ancient gathering places have been lost, especially as natural processes and modern development altered the landscape. The mystery becomes even more complex because the meaning of these objects cannot always be separated from the places where they were found. A copper ornament, carved stone, or decorated vessel is not merely a valuable artifact. Within Caddo traditions, objects could carry histories, responsibilities, and spiritual significance. A treasure measured only by material value may overlook what made these items important to the people who created them. Over the years, stories have circulated about hidden caches near ancient mound sites. Some accounts describe explorers discovering unusual objects before losing track of their locations. Others tell of forgotten ceremonial areas deep within forests where valuable items may have been protected from outsiders. These stories are difficult to verify, and many remain part of regional folklore rather than established history. Still, they raise an interesting question. How much of the ancient Caddo world remains undiscovered? The southeastern United States contains countless archaeological sites, many of which have never been fully investigated. Flooding, erosion, vegetation growth, and changes in land use have concealed traces of earlier communities. A ceremonial location that once served hundreds of people may now appear as nothing more than a small rise in the ground. Modern technology has changed the way researchers explore these landscapes. Remote sensing, careful excavation, and improved archaeological methods have revealed structures and artifacts that would have been impossible to identify in earlier generations. Each discovery adds to a clearer understanding of Caddo history, while also revealing how much remains unknown. Some more speculative theories suggest that hidden ceremonial treasures could still exist in untouched locations, waiting beneath ancient mounds or forgotten settlements. Others believe that the greatest treasures are not physical objects at all, but the knowledge preserved through Caddo descendants and cultural traditions. Today, Caddo communities continue to maintain connections to their ancestral lands and heritage. The ancient mounds and archaeological sites scattered across the region are not simply reminders of the past. They are evidence of a living history that continues into the present. The search for lost treasures often focuses on what may be buried underground. But perhaps the deeper mystery lies in understanding the world that created those objects, the ceremonies, beliefs, and stories that gave them meaning. Across the quiet forests and river valleys of the Caddo homeland, traces of that world remain. Beneath layers of soil and time, forgotten places may still hold evidence of ceremonies once performed and treasures once protected. Whether these objects will ever be found, or whether some secrets were intentionally carried beyond the reach of history, remains an unanswered question waiting within the ancient landscape. The mystery of the Caddo temple treasures reminds us that sacred places often hold meanings far beyond what can be measured or recovered. Across generations, communities have protected important knowledge, objects, and traditions through times of uncertainty. In the wetlands and forests of Florida, another story emerges, one connected not to towering mounds, but to hidden landscapes where survival depended on secrecy, movement, and careful knowledge of the land. The Florida wilderness is a world shaped by water. Cypress trees rise from dark swamps, rivers wind through dense vegetation, and countless islands and wetlands create a landscape that seems to shift with every season. Beneath the canopy, narrow trails disappear into the forest, while waterways create natural passages known only to those familiar with the terrain. For the Seminole people, this environment became more than a homeland. It became a place of refuge. Within this vast wilderness, stories have long circulated about hidden meeting places and concealed gathering sites, including legends of a secret council cave where Seminole leaders once gathered away from the eyes of outsiders. The exact location of such a cave has never been confirmed, yet the idea is connected to a very real chapter of Seminole history, a period when survival required strategy, secrecy, and adaptation. The Seminole emerged as a distinct indigenous community in Florida during the 18th century, shaped by a mixture of native peoples, including Muskogee groups, indigenous communities already living in Florida, and others who sought refuge from conflicts farther north. Over time, they developed their own identity, language patterns, and traditions within the unique environment of the Florida Peninsula. Their relationship with the land was central to their survival. When the United States government attempted to remove indigenous communities from the Southeast during the 19th century, Florida became the center of intense conflict. The Seminole Wars were among the longest and most difficult military campaigns fought by the United States against indigenous peoples. Dense forests, swamps, and waterways gave Seminole communities advantages that unfamiliar forces struggled to overcome. Small groups could disappear into landscapes that seemed impossible to navigate. During these conflicts, leadership and communication became essential. Decisions about movement, defense, diplomacy, and survival had to be made carefully. Hidden meeting locations would have offered practical advantages, allowing leaders to discuss strategies away from enemy forces and outside observers. Could a secluded cave have served such a purpose? The possibility is not impossible. Florida contains numerous caves, sinkholes, rock shelters, and concealed natural formations. Some areas are difficult to access even today. Before modern roads and mapping technology, many locations could remain known only to those who inherited knowledge of the landscape. However, historians have found no confirmed archaeological evidence identifying a specific council cave used by Seminole leaders. The legend appears to exist somewhere between historical possibility and oral tradition. Some stories describe a hidden chamber deep within the wilderness where elders gathered during times of war. Others suggest that important documents, weapons, or ceremonial objects may have been stored in secret locations to prevent them from being captured. These accounts are difficult to verify, but they reflect a broader reality. During periods of conflict, protecting information and resources was essential. The Seminole were not simply hiding from opponents. They were navigating a rapidly changing world. The forests and wetlands of Florida became places where geography itself became a form of defense. Paths were concealed. Camps could be moved quickly. Water routes provided access where soldiers struggled to travel. Knowledge of seasons, animals, and weather patterns allowed Seminole communities to survive against much larger forces. This understanding of the landscape may be the true foundation behind stories of hidden places. Over time, explorers, treasure hunters, and historians have searched areas associated with Seminole resistance, hoping to uncover evidence of forgotten camps or meeting sites. Some have reported finding unusual rock formations, abandoned shelters, or locations that appear suited for gatherings. Yet, without clear documentation or archaeological evidence, these discoveries remain open to interpretation. More speculative versions of the legend suggest that the hidden cave contained something more than a meeting place. Some stories speak of lost belongings carried during wartime, while others imagine sacred objects placed in protection from outsiders. Such ideas are difficult to confirm, but they continue to reflect a recurring theme in indigenous history: Important things are sometimes hidden not because they are forgotten, but because they are valued. Archaeological research in Florida continues to reveal more about Seminole history and the broader indigenous presence in the region. Advances in technology have helped researchers locate ancient settlements, environmental changes, and evidence of past human activity. Still, many areas remain difficult to study because of thick vegetation, shifting wetlands, and the importance of respecting culturally significant places. Perhaps the mystery of the Hidden Council Cave survives because it represents something larger than a single location. It symbolizes the intelligence, resilience, and determination of a people who used every advantage available to protect their communities. Today, the forests of Florida remain filled with quiet places where history and landscape meet. Water moves slowly through the same wetlands where Seminole families once traveled. Trees grow over paths that may have guided generations. Beneath the surface of this changing environment, forgotten traces of the past may still remain. Whether a specific council cave truly existed, or whether the legend preserves memories of many hidden gathering places, the question continues to invite exploration. Somewhere within the vast Florida wilderness, there may still be stories waiting beneath the roots, stones, and waters, stories of decisions made in secrecy, and of a people who understood that survival sometimes depended on knowing where the world could not follow. The hidden gathering places of the Seminole reveal how landscapes can become shields, preserving the movements and decisions of people who fought to protect their homes. Across Florida's forests and wetlands, survival depended on knowing where to move and when to disappear. Far to the west, among volcanic cliffs and rugged lava fields, another indigenous resistance story unfolded, one where the land itself became a fortress, and escape routes became a matter of survival. The landscape of Northern California and Southern Oregon appears almost otherworldly. Black volcanic rock stretches across the horizon, broken by deep ravines, narrow passages, and fields of hardened lava formed by ancient eruptions. Sparse vegetation grows between jagged formations, while hidden caves and twisting pathways create a natural maze unlike almost any other environment in North America. This was the homeland of the Modoc people. For generations, the Modoc lived around the region of Tule Lake and the Klamath Basin, adapting to a landscape shaped by water, volcanic terrain, and seasonal movement. Their knowledge of the land was extensive. They understood hidden springs, sheltered valleys, and routes through the lava beds that outsiders could barely navigate. That knowledge would become crucial during one of the most unusual conflicts between an indigenous nation and the United States government. The Modoc War of 1872 to 1873 was a relatively small conflict, but it gained national attention because of the extraordinary defensive position chosen by Modoc leaders. After tensions grew between the Modoc and government authorities, a group led by Kintpuash, known by the English name Captain Jack, left the reservation and returned to their traditional homeland near Tule Lake. Seeking protection, they moved into the Lava Beds National Monument area, a landscape of sharp volcanic formations, caves, and narrow corridors. To outside forces, it appeared impossible to defend such a place. To the Modoc, it was home. The lava beds created a natural stronghold. Rock formations provided shelter. Hidden passages allowed movement without easy detection. Small groups could observe approaching soldiers from concealed positions and disappear into the terrain before larger forces could respond. Military commanders struggled to understand the environment. Maps were incomplete. Soldiers unfamiliar with the region often moved slowly through the jagged landscape, while Modoc fighters used their knowledge of every ridge and passage to their advantage. Among the most fascinating elements of this conflict is the legend of hidden escape routes within the lava beds. Historical evidence confirms that the Modoc used concealed paths and natural formations to move between defensive positions. They created a network of routes that allowed them to gather supplies, relocate quickly, and avoid direct confrontation when necessary. However, the exact details of these pathways remain difficult to reconstruct. Could there still be forgotten routes within the volcanic maze? The possibility continues to interest historians and researchers. The lava beds are filled with countless caves, tunnels, and narrow channels created by ancient volcanic activity. Many formations are difficult to enter and even harder to navigate. A passage used by the Modoc in the 19th century may no longer be easily identifiable after generations of erosion, vegetation growth, and changing conditions. During the conflict, some military reports described Modoc fighters appearing almost unexpectedly and disappearing moments later. To soldiers unfamiliar with the terrain, their movements seemed almost impossible to predict. Yet, what appeared mysterious may have been the result of deep environmental knowledge developed over generations. The idea of a secret escape route became part of the larger legend surrounding the Modoc resistance. Some stories suggest that the Modoc knew of hidden caves where supplies, weapons, or important belongings were stored. Others describe underground passages connecting different areas of the lava beds, allowing people to move unseen beneath the landscape. While some natural tunnels do exist in the region, no confirmed evidence has established a single hidden route matching these legends. The mystery is complicated by the events that followed. After months of conflict, negotiations between Modoc leaders and U.S. officials failed. In 1873, several Modoc leaders were captured following the killing of government representatives during a peace meeting. Captain Jack and others were later executed, while many Modoc people were imprisoned or removed from their homeland. The resistance ended, but the landscape remained. Over time, historians and archaeologists studied the lava beds to better understand the conflict. Artifacts, defensive positions, and historical records have revealed much about how the Modoc used the environment. Yet, the full story of their movements remains incomplete. Some researchers believe that the greatest mystery is not a physical tunnel or hidden passage, but the knowledge itself. The Modoc understood a landscape that outsiders saw only as a barrier. Every rock formation, every narrow opening, and every natural landmark carried information passed through generations. Modern technology has made exploration easier, but the lava beds continue to challenge those who enter them. Satellite imagery can reveal patterns from above, yet it cannot always explain how people moved through the terrain on foot more than a century ago. The volcanic landscape remains silent, holding the memory of a conflict that demonstrated how geography can shape history. Beneath the dark stone fields of the lava beds, traces of old pathways may still exist, hidden among countless formations that look almost identical to the untrained eye. Perhaps the final mystery is not whether an escape route existed, but how much of the Modoc world remains concealed within the landscape they once defended. Somewhere among those ancient rocks and forgotten passages, the echoes of their resistance may still remain, waiting for the next discovery to reveal what the land has kept hidden. The hidden pathways of the Modoc resistance reveal how knowledge of a landscape can become a form of protection. A narrow passage through volcanic stone, a concealed trail, or a familiar landmark can hold the difference between survival and disappearance. Yet, some mysteries are not hidden in the earth itself. They are carried through generations in objects whose meanings reach far beyond their physical form. Among the forests, rivers, and lakes of the northeastern woodlands, few objects hold greater cultural importance than the wampum belts of the Haudenosaunee. Along the shores of the Great Lakes, and the rivers of what is now New York State, Pennsylvania, and surrounding regions, landscapes that appear peaceful today once served as the center of a powerful indigenous political world. Forests stretched across vast territories. Waterways connected distant communities. Villages stood beside fields and rivers where diplomacy, ceremony, and decision-making shaped the future of entire nations. Within this world, carefully crafted belts made from white and purple shell beads became some of the most significant records of Haudenosaunee history. These were not ordinary decorations. Wampum belts served as important cultural and diplomatic objects among the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. The belts recorded agreements, treaties, important events, and traditional knowledge. Their patterns could preserve messages that were remembered and interpreted by designated keepers. In a society where history was maintained through oral tradition, wampum provided a powerful visual guide connecting generations. The creation of these belts required skill and patience. Shell beads were shaped, polished, and carefully arranged into patterns that carried specific meanings. The value of a belt did not come from the material alone, but from the history and responsibilities attached to it. Among the most famous examples is the Hiawatha belt, traditionally associated with the founding of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Other belts documented agreements between indigenous nations and later relationships with European powers. Together, these objects represented a living archive of political thought and cultural memory. Yet, over time, some of these important belts disappeared. The mystery of the missing wampum belts is not a single event, but a collection of unanswered questions. Some belts were lost during periods of conflict. Others may have been taken, misplaced, or separated from the communities responsible for preserving them. How many important records of Haudenosaunee history have vanished without leaving a trace? The answer may never be known. European colonization created dramatic changes in how wampum was treated. Some colonial officials recognized the importance of these belts and recorded their existence. Others viewed them primarily as objects of trade or curiosity, rather than as living documents carrying legal and spiritual meaning. During wars, migrations, and forced relocations, many indigenous communities experienced the disruption of traditional systems. Objects that had been carefully protected for generations could be lost during moments of uncertainty. A belt carried by a diplomatic leader might disappear during travel. Another might remain hidden for safety and never be recovered. Historical records confirm that many wampum belts survived. Some remain in Haudenosaunee communities today, where they continue to hold cultural significance. Others are preserved in museums and archives around the world, but the fate of many others remains uncertain. Some researchers believe missing belts may still exist in private collections, archives, or museums where their origins are not fully recognized. Throughout history, indigenous artifacts were often collected without proper documentation, creating difficulties in tracing their journeys. A belt removed from its original context may lose the information needed to understand its full meaning. Other possibilities are more difficult to investigate. Some traditions suggest that important objects were intentionally hidden during times of danger. This practice would not have been unusual. Communities facing threats often protected sacred items by placing them in secure locations known only to trusted individuals. If knowledge of those hiding places disappeared, the objects could remain concealed for generations. Could some wampum belts still rest somewhere unknown? The possibility cannot be completely dismissed, though no specific hidden collection has been verified. The landscape itself offers many places where objects could remain undisturbed. Forests have expanded over old settlements. Riverbanks have shifted. Former village locations have changed through agriculture and development. A small container holding carefully protected belts could easily become invisible over time. More speculative stories have suggested that some missing belts may contain lost knowledge about forgotten agreements, ancient migrations, or connections between distant communities. While such claims are difficult to confirm, they reflect the deeper importance of wampum. These belts were never simply records of the past. They represented relationships, responsibilities, and collective memory. Modern efforts to understand wampum have increasingly focused on indigenous interpretation rather than viewing the belts only as historical artifacts. Haudenosaunee scholars and cultural leaders continue preserving knowledge connected to existing belts, ensuring that their meanings remain connected to the communities that created them. Archaeology and archival research have also contributed new information, but some questions remain beyond the reach of written documents. The disappearance of a wampum belt is not only the loss of an object. It can represent the loss of a story, a diplomatic agreement, or a piece of collective identity. Today, the search for missing wampum belts continues in quiet ways. Researchers examine old records. Communities preserve oral histories. Museums reassess collections. Each discovery has the potential to restore a connection that was interrupted long ago. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not where the missing belts are located, but how many stories disappeared with them. Somewhere within forgotten archives, private collections, or landscapes once traveled by Haudenosaunee leaders, pieces of this living history may still remain. Hidden away by time, circumstance, or deliberate protection, these lost wampum belts continue to raise a question that has endured for generations. What messages from the past are still waiting to be found? The missing wampum belts of the Haudenosaunee reveal how fragile the connection between memory and the physical world can be. A carefully crafted object can carry centuries of knowledge, yet a single moment of conflict, displacement, or neglect can separate it from the people who understand its meaning. Along the waterways and forests of the southeastern United States, another mystery emerges, one surrounding ceremonial places that once stood at the heart of a powerful indigenous society, but whose locations and stories have become increasingly difficult to trace. Across northern Florida and parts of southern Georgia, the landscape is shaped by rivers, wetlands, forests, and coastal plains. The St. Johns River moves slowly through ancient territories, connecting inland forests with the Atlantic coast. Beneath the shade of oak trees, and beneath layers of modern development, lie traces of communities that existed long before European ships reached these shores. These were the lands of the Timucua people. For centuries, the Timucua occupied a vast region of the southeastern woodlands. They were not a single unified nation, but a collection of related communities connected through language, trade, traditions, and shared cultural practices. Their villages were scattered across a landscape rich with natural resources, where fishing, hunting, gathering, and agriculture supported complex societies. At the center of many Timucua communities were ceremonial spaces. These places were more than gathering areas. They represented connections between leaders, communities, ancestors, and spiritual traditions. Large village sites often included plazas, council areas, burial locations, and elevated earthworks that shaped the physical and social organization of the settlement. Some of these ceremonial centers were among the most important places in the region. Yet today, many remain poorly understood. The mystery of the lost Timucua ceremonial centers begins with a simple question. Where did all of these places go? Historical records from early European explorers provide glimpses into Timucua life. Spanish expeditions entering Florida during the 16th century encountered large villages, powerful chiefs, and organized communities. They described ceremonial gatherings, political meetings, and religious practices that reflected a sophisticated understanding of society and the natural world. However, these accounts were written by outsiders. The Spanish observers recorded what they saw, but they often interpreted indigenous traditions through their own cultural beliefs. Important details about ceremonies, sacred spaces, and community organization were frequently misunderstood or left unexplained. Archaeology has helped fill some of these gaps. Excavations across the Timucua region have revealed pottery, tools, shell objects, burial areas, and evidence of large settlements. These discoveries demonstrate that Timucua communities were deeply connected to their environment and developed complex ways of organizing village life. But many questions remain. How many ceremonial centers once existed? How large were they at their height? And how much knowledge about these places disappeared before anyone could record it? One reason these centers became difficult to identify is the nature of their construction. Unlike stone monuments that can survive thousands of years, many southeastern indigenous structures were built using wood, earth, shells, and other natural materials. Wooden buildings eventually decayed, earthworks eroded, floods and changing waterways altered the landscape. Over centuries, a major ceremonial location could become almost invisible. A place that once held gatherings, ceremonies, and important decisions might eventually appear as nothing more than a slight rise in the ground. The arrival of Europeans brought even greater disruption. The Spanish established missions throughout Timucua territory during the 17th century. These missions created new political and religious systems that transformed traditional ways of life. While some Timucua communities adapted to these changes, others experienced increasing pressure from disease, warfare, and colonial expansion. Epidemics were especially devastating. Diseases introduced from Europe spread through indigenous populations that had no previous exposure, causing enormous losses. Entire communities were weakened within generations. As populations declined, many villages were abandoned, relocated, or combined with neighboring groups. By the 18th century, the Timucua population had been dramatically reduced, and their language and cultural presence had nearly disappeared as a distinct identity. But disappearance from historical records does not mean disappearance of history. The remains of Timucua ceremonial centers continue to provide evidence of a world that was once far more extensive than many early accounts suggested. Some archaeological sites along rivers and coastal areas reveal signs of large gatherings and ceremonial activity. Mounds, plazas, and village remains suggest that certain locations served as important centers of influence. Yet many potential sites remain hidden beneath forests, farmland, and modern communities. Could there still be undiscovered Timucua ceremonial places waiting beneath the landscape? Researchers believe it is possible. The southeastern United States contains thousands of archaeological sites, many of which have never been fully investigated. Dense vegetation, changing waterways, and limited historical records make locating ancient settlements challenging. New discoveries continue to reshape understanding of indigenous life in the region. Local traditions have also contributed to stories of forgotten Timucua places. Some accounts describe unusual earth formations, hidden mounds, or areas where artifacts appear unexpectedly after storms or changes in the land. Such discoveries can provide valuable clues, although archaeologists carefully examine each find before connecting it to a specific culture or period. More speculative stories suggest that some ceremonial centers may have contained hidden objects, sacred materials, or knowledge intentionally protected from outsiders. While these ideas are difficult to confirm, they reflect a historical reality. Indigenous communities often placed deep importance on protecting culturally significant items and locations. The mystery surrounding Timucua ceremonial centers is not only about lost places, it is also about lost perspectives. For generations, many indigenous histories were recorded primarily through the writings of outsiders. Archaeology can reveal structures and artifacts, but understanding the meaning behind those places requires cultural knowledge, oral traditions, and careful interpretation. A ceremonial center was not simply a collection of buildings. It was a place where communities connected with their ancestors, where leaders made decisions, where ceremonies marked important moments, and where relationships between people and the natural world were renewed. The disappearance of these places represents more than a physical loss. It represents a disruption in the transmission of memory. Today, researchers continue studying Timucua sites throughout Florida and Georgia, using archaeology, historical records, and collaboration with indigenous communities to better understand the past. Each discovery adds another piece to a story that was never truly erased, only hidden beneath layers of time. The rivers continue flowing through the same lands where Timucua villages once stood. Forests grow over places where ceremonies may have taken place. Beneath the soil, traces of ancient communities remain preserved. Perhaps future discoveries will reveal more about these forgotten centers and the people who gathered within them. Perhaps some locations will remain hidden forever, protected by the same landscape that once surrounded them. And so the mystery remains. How many Timucua ceremonial centers are still waiting beneath the surface, holding memories of a world that vanished from sight but never completely disappeared? The lost ceremonial centers of the Timucua remind us that knowledge is often preserved in places as much as in objects. A gathering ground, a sacred mound, or a carefully maintained tradition can carry the memory of generations. Yet, when those places are abandoned and the voices connected to them become quieter, entire worlds of understanding can seem to disappear. Across the ancient homelands of the Cherokee people, another mystery emerges, one involving sacred knowledge, spiritual guardians, and the stories that may have been carried away, hidden or lost through time. Deep within the Appalachian Mountains, where forests cover steep ridges and rivers carve pathways through valleys, the landscape appears timeless. Mist rises between ancient trees. Narrow trails follow routes traveled for countless generations. Mountains that seem unchanging have witnessed migrations, ceremonies, conflicts, and moments of transformation. For the Cherokee people, this landscape was not simply a wilderness. It was a living world filled with meaning. Within Cherokee society, knowledge was preserved through many forms: oral traditions, ceremonies, symbols, stories, songs, and the teachings of respected elders and spiritual leaders. Among those entrusted with important cultural responsibilities were medicine people and ceremonial leaders, sometimes described by outsiders as priests or spiritual specialists. They were keepers of knowledge. But what happened to the sacred records, teachings, and archives associated with these guardians? The idea of lost Cherokee sacred archives has remained a subject of fascination, because Cherokee history contains many examples of knowledge that existed beyond written documents. Unlike European traditions that often relied on books and formal archives, many Cherokee teachings were preserved through memory, practice, and community responsibility. The absence of a written record does not mean the absence of history. For centuries, Cherokee communities maintained complex systems of knowledge. They understood seasonal cycles, medicinal plants, astronomy, agriculture, diplomacy, and spiritual traditions connected to the natural world. Important information was not simply stored away. It was practiced, repeated, and passed from one generation to another. However, major disruptions changed how this knowledge was preserved. The arrival of European settlers brought new political pressures, conflicts, and diseases. As colonial expansion moved deeper into Cherokee homelands, communities faced increasing challenges. Land loss, warfare, and forced migration disrupted traditional ways of life. One of the most significant events was the forced removal of many Cherokee people from their southeastern homelands during the 1830s. The journey that became known as the Trail of Tears resulted in immense suffering and the loss of lives, homes, and cultural belongings. during such periods of upheaval, what happened to sacred objects and important knowledge? Some traditions suggest that certain ceremonial items and teachings were protected by being hidden or carried away. This would not have been unusual. Communities facing threats often safeguarded important cultural materials, ensuring that outsiders could not easily take or destroy them. Could hidden collections of Cherokee knowledge still exist? The possibility has inspired many stories, although specific claims are difficult to verify. Historical evidence confirms that Cherokee communities preserved important records and cultural materials in various forms. Some documents were written using the Cherokee syllabary developed by Sequoyah in the early 19th century. Others were recorded through interactions with missionaries, government officials, and historians. But many forms of knowledge were never intended to exist on paper. Sacred teachings often belonged to specific individuals or ceremonial groups. They were shared according to tradition, responsibility, and readiness. A teaching could be considered incomplete or misunderstood if removed from the cultural setting that gave it meaning. This creates a unique kind of mystery. A lost archive is usually imagined as a hidden collection of documents waiting to be discovered. But a sacred archive can also exist as memory carried by people. It can survive through songs, ceremonies, and practices even when physical evidence disappears. Still, stories of hidden Cherokee archives have continued for generations. Some accounts describe forgotten manuscripts, ceremonial objects, or collections of traditional knowledge stored in remote locations. Others suggest that important materials were concealed during periods of conflict to prevent them from being taken by outsiders. There is no confirmed evidence of a single hidden archive containing the complete sacred knowledge of Cherokee priests. However, the historical circumstances that created these legends are real. Displacement, cultural disruption, and the loss of physical objects occurred throughout the colonial period. The Appalachian landscape itself has contributed to these mysteries. The Cherokee homeland includes vast forests, mountain valleys, and remote areas where travel was once difficult. Before modern roads and mapping systems, certain locations could remain known only to specific families or communities. A small cave, sheltered valley, or protected site could hold significance for generations without appearing in outside records. Archaeology has revealed many aspects of Cherokee life, including village structures, tools, pottery, and trade networks. Yet archaeology cannot always uncover the meaning behind sacred places. A location may appear ordinary from a scientific perspective while holding deep cultural importance. This difference between physical evidence and cultural memory is central to understanding the mystery. Some researchers have explored whether early European accounts overlooked or misunderstood Cherokee intellectual traditions. Colonial observers often searched for written records similar to their own traditions, sometimes failing to recognize oral knowledge systems as sophisticated forms of historical preservation. The Cherokee had systems for remembering events, maintaining laws, and preserving spiritual teachings long before outsiders documented their existence. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is the belief that knowledge must be written to survive. Across generations, Cherokee communities have continued preserving language, traditions, ceremonies, and cultural teachings. The survival of these traditions demonstrates that history can endure even after extraordinary disruption. Yet, questions remain. Were there physical collections of sacred materials that disappeared during times of conflict? Were ceremonial objects hidden and never recovered? Did certain teachings survive only within small circles of knowledge keepers, leaving no visible trace for historians to find? Some stories suggest that hidden places in the mountains may still contain evidence of forgotten chapters of Cherokee history. Others believe the most important archives were never lost because they were carried forward through the people themselves. The search for lost archives also raises questions about ownership and interpretation. If sacred materials were discovered, who would have the right to study them? Would their meaning change if removed from their original cultural context? Could something deeply spiritual ever be fully understood by someone outside the tradition that created it? These questions continue to shape conversations between researchers, museums, and indigenous communities. Today, Cherokee cultural preservation efforts continue across the communities connected to Cherokee heritage. Language programs, historical research, traditional practices, and oral teachings remain important ways of protecting knowledge that survived generations of change. The mountains of the Cherokee homeland remain quiet witnesses to this history. Rivers continue moving through valleys where ceremonies once took place. Forests cover paths that connected communities long before modern boundaries existed. Somewhere within this landscape, fragments of the past may still remain, perhaps in the form of forgotten objects, hidden records, or places whose importance has never been revealed. But perhaps the deepest mystery is not where the lost archives are located. It is how much knowledge can survive without ever being placed inside a physical archive at all. The question remains open. What stories, teachings, and memories are still preserved beyond the reach of written history, waiting for the right moment to be understood? As the echoes of the previous mystery slowly fade into the quiet, another path begins to emerge, one worn not by countless travelers, but by generations of ritual. Deep beneath the sheltering canopy of the southeastern forests, where rivers wind through ancient cypress swamps and morning mist lingers long after sunrise, there once stood ceremonial grounds unlike any other. Here, before the first rays of daylight touched the earth, fires burned low, voices remained hushed, and a dark liquid was carefully prepared in silence. To outsiders, it appeared to be only a drink. To those who gathered around it, however, it represented something far more profound. Long before European ships appeared along the Atlantic coast, the forests of what is now the southeastern United States were home to complex societies whose traditions stretched back centuries. Among the peoples known today as the Creek, Cherokee, Yuchi, Caddo, Timucua, and several others, ceremonies marked nearly every important moment of communal life. Some celebrated harvests, others honored ancestors. Still, others prepared leaders and warriors for difficult decisions. At the center of many of these rituals was something historians now call the Black Drink. Its original names differed from nation to nation, each reflecting unique languages and spiritual traditions. Yet, European explorers, unable to fully understand its cultural significance, simply described what they saw: a nearly black liquid consumed in remarkable quantities before dawn. The drink itself was made primarily from the roasted leaves of the yaupon holly, Ilex vomitoria, a plant native to the coastal plains and forests of the American Southeast. Unlike most plants indigenous to North America, yaupon naturally contains caffeine. In fact, its caffeine concentration rivals that of many modern teas. For centuries, botanists assumed the species name vomitoria reflected the plant's natural effects. Later research revealed this to be misleading. The vomiting frequently observed during ceremonies was not caused by the plant itself. Instead, it resulted from the ritual manner in which enormous quantities were consumed, sometimes accompanied by fasting and other ceremonial practices. This misunderstanding became one of many examples of how early European observers documented native traditions through unfamiliar cultural lenses. To the participants, however, the purpose was never simply physical cleansing. Historical accounts describe ceremonial plazas where fires burned throughout the night. Wooden benches were arranged according to strict traditions. Sacred objects rested nearby. Only certain individuals were permitted to prepare the drink, often following precise methods passed through generations. Everything about the process emphasized order. Nothing appears accidental. Even today, archaeologists continue uncovering evidence suggesting that these ceremonies were remarkably standardized across vast distances. Similar drinking vessels, ceremonial plazas, and ritual objects have been found hundreds of miles apart, implying communication between communities that shared common spiritual ideas despite speaking different languages. How did these traditions remain so consistent over centuries? Some historians argue that extensive trade networks carried not only goods, but religious practices throughout the Southeast. Others wonder whether the remarkable similarities point toward an even older ceremonial tradition whose origins have largely disappeared. One clue lies within the plant itself. Yaupon grows naturally only in certain regions, primarily near the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coastal plain. Yet, archaeological discoveries have uncovered residues consistent with black drink use in locations hundreds of miles beyond the plant's natural range. This means the leaves were transported across enormous distances. The trade required organization, planning, and demand. Communities far inland valued the drink enough to import it regularly. Why? If caffeine alone were the attraction, other stimulants might have served similar purposes. Instead, evidence suggests the plant possessed ceremonial importance beyond its chemical properties. Among many southeastern nations, black drink rituals preceded council meetings, diplomatic negotiations, declarations of war, seasonal festivals, and major religious ceremonies. Participants often fasted beforehand. Conversation remained formal. Personal conflicts were expected to be set aside. The drink prepared both body and mind. European observers frequently misunderstood these gatherings, focusing on the more dramatic aspects they witnessed. They recorded repeated drinking, vomiting, chanting, and solemn silence, sometimes describing the ceremonies as strange or frightening. Yet, modern anthropologists emphasize that purification rituals exist across cultures worldwide. Removing physical impurities often symbolized removing emotional burdens, harmful intentions, or spiritual imbalance. Within native traditions, cleansing frequently represented renewal rather than punishment. The body became a reflection of the community itself. Harmony within one supported harmony within the other. Still, many aspects remain uncertain. Very little was written directly by native participants during the earliest centuries of European contact. Most surviving descriptions come from explorers, missionaries, traders, or colonial officials. Each brought personal assumptions. Each interpreted unfamiliar rituals through the beliefs of their own cultures. As a result, historians often find themselves reading between the lines, comparing fragmented accounts separated by decades. Sometimes those accounts agree remarkably well. Other times they contradict each other completely. One Spanish chronicler described the ceremony as dignified and deeply spiritual. Another portrayed it as intimidating. French traders emphasized diplomacy. English colonists often focused on military preparation. Which version comes closest to reality? Perhaps each witnessed only one variation among many. After all, dozens of native nations practiced related ceremonies while maintaining distinct customs. The black drink may have been less a single ritual than an entire family of traditions. Archaeology has begun revealing another fascinating layer. Excavations at Mississippian ceremonial centers, including sites occupied centuries before sustained European contact, have uncovered specialized cups fashioned from marine shells. Some feature engraved symbols representing birds, serpents, celestial bodies, and supernatural beings. Residue analysis suggests many once contained caffeinated beverages consistent with yaupon. These cups were anything but ordinary. Some required enormous craftsmanship. Marine shells traveled hundreds of miles inland from coastal waters. Their transformation into ceremonial vessels demanded skilled artisans. ownership may have been restricted to religious leaders or high-ranking individuals. If so, drinking from these vessels represented participation in sacred authority itself. Certain shell engravings belong to what researchers call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a widespread artistic and religious tradition spanning much of the eastern United States between roughly AD 1000 and 1600. Its symbols continue appearing across distant archaeological sites. Winged figures, eyes enclosed within circles, crosses inside suns, hand motifs, serpents winding through abstract landscapes. Many meanings remain uncertain. Some almost certainly represented stories once known by everyone who viewed them. Today, those stories survive only in fragments. Could the black drink ceremonies have formed part of this larger ceremonial system? Most archaeologists believe so. The timing, locations, and associated artifacts strongly suggest close connections. Yet exactly how these rituals fit within broader religious beliefs remains an open question. And then there are the accounts of altered perception. Modern science explains that consuming large amounts of caffeine, especially after prolonged fasting, can produce heightened alertness, trembling, rapid heartbeat, and unusual psychological effects. Sleep deprivation may intensify these sensations further. Participants preparing for important ceremonies often remained awake through much of the night. Combined together, these factors alone could produce deeply memorable experiences. But some oral traditions hint at something more. Certain elders spoke of gaining exceptional clarity during ceremonies. Not hallucinations, not visions in the dramatic sense often imagined today. Instead, they described sharpened awareness, a state in which ordinary distractions faded, allowing important truths to become easier to recognize. Decisions affecting entire communities demanded clear minds. Perhaps the ritual intentionally cultivated precisely that. Still, later interpretations ventured further. 19th century writers occasionally suggested that black drink ceremonies opened communication with unseen realms. 20th century occult authors expanded these ideas dramatically, portraying the beverage as a forgotten entheogen despite lacking supporting evidence. Most researchers reject these claims, noting that Yaupon's chemistry is well understood and contains no known hallucinogenic compounds. Yet, the persistence of such theories raises another question. Why do so many people continue searching for hidden meanings within these ceremonies? Perhaps because the surviving evidence feels incomplete. The ritual appears simultaneously familiar and inaccessible. We understand its ingredients. We understand many of its contexts. Yet its deepest significance often seems just beyond reach. Language may be part of the reason. Many spiritual concepts expressed in native languages resist direct translation into English. Words describing balance, sacred responsibility, relationships between humans and the natural world, or obligations toward ancestors frequently carry layers of meaning impossible to capture with simple equivalents. When translators reduced complex ceremonies into brief written descriptions, much inevitably disappeared. Imagine attempting to explain an entire worldview using only a handful of borrowed words. Something essential would almost certainly remain unspoken. This challenge extends beyond language alone. Many native communities intentionally restricted sacred knowledge. Certain teachings belonged only within ceremonies themselves. Not everything was meant for outsiders. Even today, some traditions remain respectfully private. Historians recognize this as an important ethical boundary. The absence of detailed explanations does not necessarily indicate lost knowledge. Sometimes it reflects knowledge deliberately protected. Even so, mysteries endure. One particularly intriguing question concerns astronomy. Several ceremonial plazas across the southeast exhibit alignments with sunrise during specific seasons. Scholars debate whether these orientations simply reflected practical planning or possessed deeper cosmological significance. If black drink ceremonies occurred before dawn, participants may have watched the first sunlight appear over carefully chosen horizons. The transition from darkness into light carried powerful symbolic meaning across many indigenous traditions. Purification, renewal, order emerging from uncertainty. The drink itself preceded sunrise. Was this timing symbolic or essential? No single answer satisfies every case. Another layer of mystery surrounds continuity. European colonization devastated native populations through disease, warfare, displacement, and forced cultural suppression. Many ceremonial grounds were abandoned. Sacred objects disappeared. Traditional knowledge fragmented under extraordinary pressure. Yet, fragments survived. Ethnographers recording oral histories during the 19th and 20th centuries found memories of black drink traditions still preserved among elders. Some ceremonial elements continued in adapted forms. Others remained private. This resilience reminds us that traditions are rarely erased completely. They change. They endure quietly. Sometimes they wait. Today, interest in Yaupon has grown once again, not as a ceremonial substance, but as a native tea appreciated for its unique flavor and historical significance. Researchers study ancient trade routes through chemical analysis, while indigenous scholars continue reclaiming traditional knowledge on their own terms, emphasizing cultural context over sensational speculation. And perhaps that is where the greatest mystery resides, not in secret ingredients or supernatural powers, not in forgotten magic hidden beneath layers of history, but in the realization that entire systems of knowledge once flourished across these forests, understood deeply by the people who lived them, while only scattered pieces have reached the present. When archaeologists uncover another engraved shell cup, when residue analysis identifies traces of roasted yaupon, when oral histories preserve another carefully remembered detail, the picture grows slightly clearer. Yet it never becomes complete. There is always another missing voice, another untranslated word, another ceremony witnessed only by those who never wrote it down. Standing in the quiet remains of an ancient ceremonial plaza today, surrounded by towering pines and the distant sound of moving water, it is easy to imagine the first glow of dawn touching the horizon as steam rose from dark wooden bowls. The participants knew exactly why they had gathered. Every gesture carried meaning. Every silence spoke. We, centuries later, can reconstruct much of what happened. But can we ever truly understand what they experienced? Or does the deepest purpose of the black drink remain where it has always been, hidden within a tradition that revealed its greatest truths only to those present before sunrise, when the world itself seemed to pause between darkness and light? As the last embers of the black drink ceremonies fade into memory, another sacred tradition begins to emerge. One rooted not in a dark liquid shared before dawn, but in living plants carefully tended beneath the endless skies of the northern plains. Here, where rolling grasslands meet rugged sandstone cliffs and winding rivers carve through broad valleys, certain patches of earth were regarded with extraordinary reverence. They appeared unremarkable to an unfamiliar traveler. A small clearing, a cluster of carefully growing plants, perhaps sheltered by cottonwoods or hidden among gentle hills. Yet, to those who knew these places, they were far more than gardens. They were sacred. And according to generations of Crow tradition, they were never ordinary fields. Across the vast landscapes of present-day Montana and Wyoming, the Apsaluki, known more commonly as the Crow Nation, developed one of the most sophisticated cultures of the northern plains. Renowned for their horsemanship, diplomacy, and deep spiritual traditions, the Crow lived in close relationship with a land that demanded constant observation. Every changing season, every migration of buffalo, every shift in weather carried meaning. But amid this seemingly untamed wilderness were places that required an entirely different kind of attention. These were tobacco gardens. Unlike the commercial tobacco cultivated across much of the modern world, the plants grown in these sacred plots often belong to species known collectively as Nicotiana quadrivalvis, sometimes called Indian tobacco. Smaller than commercial varieties yet deeply significant, these plants occupied an important place in the ceremonial life of several indigenous nations throughout western North America. For the Crow, tobacco was never simply something to smoke. It was a sacred gift. It accompanied prayers, it sealed agreements, it honored spirits, it acknowledged gratitude. In many ceremonies, offering tobacco represented one of the most profound gestures a person could make. Because of this, cultivating the plant became a responsibility carried with immense care. Historical accounts suggest that only certain families or designated keepers maintained these gardens. Knowledge surrounding their cultivation passed through generations, often accompanied by ceremonial obligations that extended far beyond ordinary agriculture. The gardens themselves were not selected merely because the soil appeared fertile. Instead, oral traditions describe locations chosen for spiritual reasons. Some rested near springs, others overlooked river valleys. Still others occupied elevated ridges where the wind moved almost constantly through the grasses. To an outside observer, these choices might appear practical: reliable water, good sunlight, natural drainage. Yet many Crow traditions suggest another layer of meaning. The land itself participated in the ceremony. Certain places were considered spiritually alive, not because something supernatural visibly occurred there, but because generations recognized them as places where communication with the unseen felt especially appropriate. Exactly how those locations were first identified remains uncertain. Some oral histories speak of dreams. Others describe visions received during fasting. Certain traditions mention respected spiritual leaders guided toward particular landscapes by signs found in nature: a bird's unexpected behavior, an unusual weather pattern, the appearance of certain animals. Modern historians approach such accounts carefully, recognizing that symbolic language often carries meanings impossible to separate from cultural context. Still, the consistency of these stories invites curiosity. How did different generations continue returning to the same sacred locations across centuries? One possibility lies in memory itself. Long before written maps became common, indigenous nations preserved remarkably detailed geographical knowledge through oral tradition. Rivers, mountains, rock formations, and ceremonial sites formed part of an interconnected cultural landscape, remembered through stories, songs, and seasonal journeys. Sacred gardens would naturally become part of that living map. But some researchers believe there may have been additional reasons these places endured. Archaeological evidence from the northern plains has revealed that certain ceremonial locations remained in use for hundreds of years. Layers of artifacts accumulate gradually. Stone circles marking old lodge sites, charcoal from repeated fires, fragments of tools, pollen preserved beneath the soil, sometimes even microscopic traces of cultivated plants. Unlike large agricultural civilizations farther south, plains communities often moved seasonally in response to buffalo migrations and environmental conditions. Yet, sacred places frequently remained fixed. Communities returned again and again, not because permanent settlements surrounded them, but because memory did. This raises another intriguing question. If mobility defined much of plains life, why invest so much effort cultivating delicate tobacco plants that required careful tending? The answer may reveal just how valuable these gardens truly were. Unlike food crops, tobacco represented spiritual continuity. It connected ceremonies across generations. Its importance could not easily be replaced through trade or wild gathering. Growing it ensured that sacred obligations remained fulfilled. Ethnographers recording Crow traditions during the 19th century encountered repeated references to tobacco societies, ceremonial organizations responsible for preserving both ritual knowledge and cultivation practices. Membership often carried significant responsibilities: songs, prayers, harvest methods, offerings. Even the timing of planting and gathering followed ceremonial calendars rather than purely agricultural ones. Every step mattered. Nothing happened casually. Observers sometimes remarked that participants treated the gardens almost as living relatives. Plants were approached respectfully. Harvests were accompanied by prayer. Offerings frequently preceded gathering. Such practices reflected a worldview in which humans existed not above nature but within it. The plants provided spiritual assistance. Humans responded with gratitude. This reciprocal relationship appears throughout many indigenous traditions across North America. Yet, among the Crow, tobacco occupied an especially central role. Still, many details remain elusive. Early European traders, missionaries, and military officials occasionally documented tobacco ceremonies, but their descriptions often focused on unfamiliar outward actions while overlooking deeper meanings. One observer described elaborate smoking rituals. Another emphasized songs. A third mentioned fasting before entering certain ceremonial spaces. Rarely did these writers fully understand what they witnessed. Language barriers complicated everything. Many spiritual concepts possessed no direct English equivalent. As a result, modern historians must compare scattered observations with oral histories preserved by Crow knowledge keepers. Sometimes they align remarkably well. Sometimes they leave important gaps. One particularly enduring mystery concerns the origins of sacred tobacco itself. Botanists know that Nicotiana quadrivalvis was cultivated by numerous indigenous peoples throughout western North America. Genetic studies suggest it underwent domestication long before European arrival. Yet, precisely where this domestication first occurred remains debated. Some researchers propose the Missouri River Basin. Others point toward regions farther west. Trade almost certainly spread seeds across vast distances. By the time European explorers documented the plains, sacred tobacco had already become deeply integrated into multiple ceremonial traditions. Did the Crow inherit tobacco cultivation from neighboring nations? Or did they independently develop unique methods after acquiring the plant? Evidence supports elements of both possibilities. Trade networks connected communities across enormous territories. Obsidian from distant mountains. Marine shells from faraway coasts. Copper from the Great Lakes. Pipestone quarried hundreds of miles away. Ideas traveled alongside these materials. Religious traditions evolved through centuries of interaction while preserving local identities. The tobacco gardens may represent one chapter within that broader history of cultural exchange. Yet, certain oral traditions hint at something even older. Some stories describe sacred tobacco as a gift received directly through spiritual encounters rather than ordinary discovery. A supernatural being reveals the plant. An ancestor returns with seeds after a vision. An animal serves as a messenger. Such narratives are not unusual within indigenous cosmologies, where knowledge often emerges through relationships between humans, animals, and spiritual forces. From a historical perspective, these stories preserve cultural memory rather than botanical explanation. But could symbolic narratives also encode practical information? Anthropologists increasingly recognize that oral traditions sometimes preserve ecological knowledge beneath metaphorical language. A story about an animal leading someone to tobacco might reflect generations of observing where particular species naturally gathered. A tale involving a spring could preserve memory of ideal growing conditions. The symbolic and practical need not contradict one another. Instead, they may exist together. Another mystery lies in the gardens themselves. Unlike large cultivated fields visible across modern farmland, sacred tobacco plots were often intentionally modest. Their exact locations were sometimes protected. Even today, many indigenous communities respectfully decline to identify certain ceremonial sites publicly. This discretion reflects more than privacy. It acknowledges the continuing sacred nature of these places. For archaeologists, however, such protection creates challenges. Without excavation, or with excavation appropriately limited, many questions remain unanswered. How large were individual gardens? How frequently were they replanted? Did different families maintain separate plots? Were ceremonies performed throughout the growing season or only during planting and harvest? The archaeological record offers only fragments. Pollen analysis occasionally identifies tobacco. Charcoal reveals ancient fires. Soil chemistry hints at repeated cultivation, yet ceremonies leave remarkably little physical evidence. Songs disappear with the final note. Prayers leave no imprint beneath the ground. Meaning itself rarely fossilizes. This absence has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some writers have suggested that sacred tobacco gardens occupied locations chosen because of unusual earth energies or naturally occurring electromagnetic fields. Others speculate that repeated ceremonial use somehow transformed the landscape over generations. At present, no scientific evidence supports these claims. Yet, they continue circulating because certain visitors describe experiencing unusual feelings in places long regarded as sacred. How should such experiences be understood? Psychologists note that expectation, cultural context, and environmental beauty can profoundly influence perception. Standing alone beside an ancient ceremonial site beneath an immense prairie sky naturally inspires reflection. Silence itself alters awareness. The wind carries sounds across astonishing distances. Cloud shadows move slowly over endless grasslands. Time seems different. Perhaps sacredness emerges not from invisible forces hidden beneath the soil, but from centuries of shared human attention focused upon a single place. Or perhaps there are dimensions of cultural experience that resist easy measurement. The question remains open. One remarkable aspect of Crow tobacco traditions involves the relationship between plants and memory. Seeds are among history's quietest travelers. Small enough to fit within a pouch, they accompany migrations, survive difficult winters, and preserve living connections between generations. A single handful of seeds may carry traditions stretching back centuries. When families carefully selected which seeds to plant each season, they preserved more than biology. They preserved identity. Colonial expansion during the 19th century disrupted countless indigenous lifeways across the northern plains. Forced relocation, changing economies, military conflict, disease, and government policies targeting traditional ceremonies all placed extraordinary pressure upon cultural practices, including sacred tobacco cultivation. Some gardens disappeared. Others continued quietly. Knowledge survived through elders determined to protect it despite immense hardship. Today, Crow cultural preservation efforts continue restoring and documenting traditional practices, including the ceremonial significance of sacred tobacco. These efforts are guided not by curiosity alone, but by the understanding that living traditions belong first to the communities that have carried them across generations. Even with renewed scholarship and collaboration between historians, botanists, and indigenous knowledge keepers, many questions remain unanswered. How many sacred gardens once existed across the plains? How old were the earliest cultivated plots? What ceremonies unfolded there before sunrise, beyond the view of traders or explorers? Which songs accompanied the first planting of each spring? And how much knowledge disappeared with those who protected these traditions but never recorded them in writing? Today, the prairie still stretches toward distant horizons, much as it did centuries ago. Cottonwoods continue lining quiet rivers. Summer winds ripple through the grasses, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Somewhere beneath those landscapes may rest the faint traces of forgotten tobacco gardens, places where generations once knelt in silence, tending plants believed to connect the human world with something far older and far greater. The soil remembers more than it reveals. The seeds carried stories that few outsiders were ever meant to hear. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not where every sacred garden once stood, but whether the deepest meaning of those carefully tended places can ever be fully recovered, or whether some truths, like the smallest seeds scattered across the prairie by the wind, were always destined to remain just beyond our reach. As the memory of the crow-sacred tobacco gardens slowly disappears into the winds of the northern plains, our journey turns toward an entirely different landscape. The endless grasslands give way to a world of towering saguaros, rugged mountain ranges, and vast stretches of desert where survival itself depends upon knowing where water can be found. Here, in the heart of the Sonoran Desert, one of the driest yet most biologically diverse deserts on Earth, water has always meant far more than life alone. For the Wampum people, certain springs were never simply sources of fresh water. They were places of origin, ceremony, memory, and mystery. Some of these springs still flow today. Others have vanished beneath shifting sands, modern development, or the slow changes of time. And according to generations of oral tradition, some were never meant to be found by everyone. At first glance, the Sonoran Desert appears unforgiving. Miles of rocky hills shimmer beneath relentless sunlight. Dry riverbeds, known as washes, remain empty for much of the year, only to transform into rushing torrents during seasonal rains. Towering saguaros stretch towards the sky, some living for nearly 2 centuries, while creosote bushes, mesquite trees, and ocotillo quietly endure conditions that seem almost impossible. Yet, hidden within this seemingly harsh landscape are places where life gathers. Cottonwoods rise unexpectedly above canyon floors. Willows cluster around damp earth. Birdsong fills the air. The temperature cools almost instantly. Somewhere nearby, water emerges from the ground. These desert springs have always been rare. For thousands of years, they became natural gathering places for humans and animals alike. Long before modern maps marked their locations, indigenous peoples possessed detailed knowledge of these precious water sources, passing their locations from one generation to the next through stories, seasonal travel, and careful observation of the land. Among those who knew these landscapes best were the O'odham peoples, including the Tohono O'odham and Acamel O'odham, whose ancestral territories stretched across what is now southern Arizona and northern Mexico. To outsiders unfamiliar with the desert, survival here might seem impossible. To the O'odham, however, the land was alive with relationships. Mountains held stories. Animals carried lessons. Plants offered medicine. And certain springs existed not merely as physical landmarks, but as sacred places connected to the earliest chapters of creation. Unlike written histories preserved in books, O'odham traditions have long been carried through oral storytelling. These narratives describe the origins of the world, the journeys of powerful spiritual beings, and the responsibilities humans hold toward the desert itself. Within many of these stories, water occupies a central role. Not abundant water, rare water, life-giving water emerging from impossible places. One of the most important sacred locations associated with these traditions is Quito Springs, an oasis situated within the Sonoran Desert near the present-day international border. For centuries, this spring has supported an astonishing variety of life despite the surrounding arid landscape. Archaeological evidence suggests that people have visited the area for thousands of years. Stone tools, ceramic fragments, ancient trails. Each reveals a long history of human presence centered around this remarkable source of fresh water. For the O'odham, however, Quito represents far more than an archaeological site. It remains deeply connected to spiritual identity. Traditional stories describe the spring as part of a sacred landscape shaped during the earliest times, when powerful beings transformed the world into its present form. Many details of these narratives remain respectfully protected within O'odham communities. Not every sacred story is intended for public retelling. This distinction is important. Modern researchers increasingly recognize that respecting cultural boundaries sometimes means accepting that certain knowledge will remain private. Yet, even within the information that has been shared, mystery persists. How did generations preserve knowledge of isolated desert springs across immense territories without written maps? One answer lies in careful observation. Experienced travelers learn to read subtle signs invisible to newcomers. The flight of birds, the appearance of certain trees, the movement of animals, changes in vegetation, slight differences in the color of distant hills. Each clue pointed toward water. To modern satellite imagery, these springs appear as tiny green patches surrounded by vast expanses of desert. To the O'odham, they formed part of an interconnected network woven into seasonal travel, ceremony, and survival. Knowledge itself became a map. Some anthropologists compare this understanding to an invisible geography. Rather than relying upon fixed roads, travelers navigated through stories. Each landmark recalled another. A distinctive mountain led toward a canyon. The canyon opened onto a wash. The wash eventually revealed a spring. The journey itself became part of cultural memory. Lose the story, and the route could disappear. Preserve the story, and the landscape remained readable. Still, certain springs occupied a different category altogether. Oral traditions describe places approached only under specific circumstances. Some required ceremonial preparation. Others were associated with particular families or spiritual leaders. Entering such locations demanded respect, not because they were dangerous in an ordinary sense, but because they existed within a sacred relationship between people and place. European explorers occasionally encountered these attitudes during the 17th and 18th centuries. Spanish missionaries documented springs regarded with unusual reverence by indigenous communities. Sometimes they interpreted these practices through Christian concepts of holy places. Other times they dismissed them as superstition. Rarely did they fully understand the cultural framework surrounding what they observed. As a result, many historical descriptions feel incomplete. They describe actions without explaining meanings. Offerings left beside water, periods of silence, ceremonial gatherings, restricted access. Each observation hints at something deeper. But what exactly? Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that many desert springs served multiple purposes across thousands of years. Some functioned as seasonal camps. Others became trading locations. Still others contain evidence of repeated ceremonial activity, including rock art, carefully arranged stone features, or artifacts deposited rather than discarded. These intentional deposits raise fascinating questions. Why place valuable objects beside springs? In practical terms, doing so seems wasteful. Yet, across cultures worldwide, water often serves as a symbolic boundary between worlds. Offerings placed into springs acknowledge relationships extending beyond ordinary exchange. Could the Odom traditions reflect similar ideas? Many scholars believe so. Without claiming precise meanings for individual sites, researchers increasingly recognize that sacred springs likely represented places where physical survival and spiritual life became inseparable. The water nourished the body. The ceremonies nourished the community. One could not exist fully without the other. Another enduring mystery involves disappearance. Historical records mention springs that no longer flow. Groundwater levels have shifted. Earthquakes subtly altered underground channels. Modern wells changed regional hydrology. Climate fluctuations reshaped fragile desert ecosystems. Some springs gradually dried. Others vanished entirely. When a sacred spring disappears, what happens to the traditions connected with it? For many indigenous communities, the answer is profoundly complex. The place remains sacred even if the visible water no longer emerges. Memory outlasts geography. The stories continue even when landscapes change. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in Odom pilgrimages. Certain ceremonial journeys historically followed ancient routes linking multiple sacred locations across the desert. Participants did not simply travel from one destination to another. They retraced the movements of ancestors and spiritual beings. Every stop carried meaning. Every spring represented another chapter in a much larger narrative. Some of these pilgrimage routes remain active today, adapted to modern circumstances while preserving ancient relationships with the land. Others survive primarily through oral history. Their exact paths may never be fully reconstructed. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative theories. A few writers have proposed that hidden springs functioned as part of secret ceremonial networks known only to initiated spiritual leaders. Others suggest undiscovered springs still exist deep within remote mountain ranges, concealed by geography and protected through generations of intentional silence. From a scientific perspective, neither claim can be confirmed. The Sonoran Desert remains vast, but modern mapping has documented most permanent water sources. Even so, temporary springs appear after unusual rainfall, while others emerge only during certain geological conditions. The desert continues surprising those who believe it has surrendered all its secrets. There are also stories, difficult to verify yet remarkably persistent, of travelers becoming hopelessly lost despite being only a short distance from known springs. Some accounts describe hearing flowing water that vanished upon approach. Others tell of unexpectedly finding pools where no spring appears on any map, only to search again later without success. As the quiet waters of the Odom sacred springs disappear behind us, another trail begins to unfold, one that leads away from the deserts of the Southwest and into the dense hardwood forests of the Ohio Valley. Here, where rivers weave through ancient woodlands and morning fog clings to the hills long after sunrise, history feels unusually close. Fallen trees slowly reclaim forgotten paths. Abandoned village sites lie hidden beneath layers of leaves, and somewhere within these forests, according to generations of stories, sacred objects once carried by one of the most influential native spiritual leaders in American history may have vanished without a trace. Were they destroyed, hidden, or are they simply waiting where no one has thought to look? The forests stretching across present-day Ohio, Indiana, and surrounding regions have witnessed centuries of change. Long before roads crossed the landscape, rivers served as the great highways of North America. Communities traded, traveled, hunted, and gathered along these waterways, leaving behind villages whose stories are still being uncovered by archaeologists today. Among the many nations who called these lands home were the Shawnee, an Algonquian-speaking people whose history was marked by resilience, migration, and adaptation. Over generations, warfare, disease, colonial expansion, and forced displacement repeatedly pushed Shawnee communities from one homeland to another. Yet, despite these upheavals, they preserved a rich spiritual tradition rooted in the relationships between people, the natural world, and the Creator. It was during one of the most turbulent periods in this history that a remarkable religious movement emerged. At its center stood a man known to history as Tenskwatawa. Before becoming a spiritual leader, Tenskwatawa's life appeared unremarkable. Born around 1775, he experienced many of the hardships facing native communities during a time of rapid colonial expansion. For years, historical accounts describe him as struggling to find purpose. Then, in 1805, everything changed. According to Shawnee tradition and historical records alike, Tenskwatawa experienced a profound spiritual vision during what many believed was a near-death experience. After recovering, he began preaching a message of renewal, urging native peoples to reject alcohol, restore traditional spiritual practices, and resist increasing dependence upon European goods and customs. His message spread with astonishing speed. Communities from across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley traveled to hear him speak. Some viewed him as a divinely inspired prophet. Others remained skeptical, yet few questioned his growing influence. Soon, his brother, Tecumseh, a gifted diplomat and military leader, joined him, helping transform the movement into one of the most significant indigenous resistance efforts in North American history. Together, the brothers established Prophetstown near the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers in present-day Indiana. To American officials observing from afar, Prophetstown appeared politically dangerous. To many native communities, however, it represented something much larger. It was a place of spiritual renewal. Families from multiple nations gathered there. Ceremonies were held. Traditional teachings were shared. Ancient customs, threatened by decades of upheaval, found new life. Within such a community, ceremonial objects naturally held profound significance. Yet here, the historical record grows unexpectedly quiet. Unlike European religious institutions, which often documented sacred objects in written inventories, Shawnee spiritual traditions relied primarily upon oral transmission. Ceremonial items existed within living practices, rather than museum collections or permanent temples. As a result, historians know surprisingly little about the physical objects associated directly with Tenskwatawa himself. References appear only in fragments. Early American military reports occasionally mention ceremonial bundles. Travelers described sacred staffs. Missionaries noted ritual objects used during gatherings. Yet detailed descriptions remain rare. Were these simply ordinary ceremonial items belonging to respected spiritual leaders? Or did certain objects become closely associated with Tenskwatawa's prophetic role? Many historians believe the latter is entirely possible. Across numerous indigenous cultures, sacred bundles occupied central places within ceremonial life. Far more than collections of objects, they represented living responsibilities carried by designated keepers. Bundles might contain feathers, stones, medicinal plants, carved objects, pipes, animal hides, or other items whose significance depended upon generations of transmitted knowledge. Their meaning rarely rested in the objects themselves. Instead, it lived within the relationships surrounding them. Who could open them? When they could be used? What prayers accompanied them? Hydrologists note that underground water movement, seasonal runoff, and changing vegetation can create temporary water sources that disappear quickly. Mirages caused by intense desert heat further complicate perception. Yet, these explanations do not entirely diminish the sense of wonder surrounding such experiences. For the O'odham, the desert has never been an empty landscape waiting to be conquered. It is a place requiring humility. Confidence alone cannot guarantee safe passage. Respect matters, patience matters, listening matters. Perhaps these lessons explain why so many sacred stories emphasize careful attention rather than dramatic miracles. The greatest mystery may not involve hidden worlds at all. It may involve seeing the visible world correctly. Another fascinating aspect concerns sound. Visitors to certain desert springs often remark upon the remarkable change in acoustics. Wind softens beneath dense vegetation. Bird calls echo differently within canyon walls. The constant background silence of the open desert gives way to trickling water and rustling leaves. After hours of walking through near silence, these sounds can feel almost startling. Some anthropologists suggest that such sensory contrasts naturally reinforce feelings of entering sacred space. The transition is unmistakable. Without walls or buildings, the landscape itself announces arrival. Modern neuroscience offers another perspective. Natural environments rich in water, shade, and biological diversity measurably affect human attention and emotional states. Stress decreases. Awareness sharpens. Time seems to slow. Could generations of ceremonial practice have recognized these psychological effects long before science developed the tools to study them? The possibility remains intriguing, yet scientific understanding explains only part of the experience. It cannot fully account for why specific springs acquired profound cultural significance while others did not. Nor can it explain why some locations continued attracting ceremonies across centuries despite dramatic historical change. Perhaps history alone offers part of the answer. Every generation leaves traces. Stories accumulate. Prayers are spoken. Children learn from elders. Journeys repeat. Eventually, a place becomes sacred not because of a single event, but because countless lives have invested it with meaning. The spring becomes a living archive, not written in ink, written in memory. Today, many sacred springs associated with the O'odham face new challenges. Urban expansion, groundwater extraction, climate change, and increased visitation place pressure upon fragile desert ecosystems that have supported life for thousands of years. Conservation efforts increasingly involve partnerships between scientists, land managers, and indigenous communities seeking to protect not only water resources, but the cultural landscape surrounding them. Even so, many questions remain unanswered. How many sacred springs have disappeared without record? How many ceremonies unfolded beside waters now hidden beneath dry earth? How much geographical knowledge existed that was intentionally kept within families, never written down, never shared beyond those entrusted to carry it forward? And perhaps most intriguing of all, could there still be quiet places within the Sonoran Desert where ancient springs continue to flow unnoticed by most travelers, known only through stories carefully preserved across generations? As evening settles over the desert, shadows lengthen beneath towering saguaros, and the heat of the day slowly begins to fade. Somewhere beyond the rocky ridges, water still rises silently through fractures in ancient stone, just as it has for countless generations. Whether hidden beneath cottonwoods, tucked inside narrow canyons, or remembered only in the words of elders, these springs continue to remind us that even in the driest landscapes, the deepest mysteries often emerge where life is least expected. The desert reveals only what it chooses to reveal, and somewhere beneath its quiet surface, it may still be guarding waters and stories that have never truly been lost, only patiently waiting for those who know how to listen. Without that knowledge, an outsider might see only ordinary materials. This creates one of the greatest challenges facing modern researchers. Historical documents written by non-native observers frequently mention sacred objects without understanding what they represented. Descriptions become frustratingly vague. A bundle, a staff, a sacred packet. No measurements, no illustrations, no explanation. Sometimes even the observers admitted they were refused permission to examine the contents. Such secrecy was neither unusual nor suspicious. Many ceremonial traditions intentionally protected sacred knowledge from public view. The absence of detailed descriptions reflects respect for cultural boundaries as much as historical uncertainty. Still, speculation inevitably followed. Everything changed again in November 1811. American forces under Governor William Henry Harrison advanced towards Prophetstown, leading to the Battle of Tippecanoe. Although the battle itself remains the subject of historical debate, one outcome is certain. After the fighting, Prophetstown was abandoned and burned. Homes disappeared. Ceremonial structures were destroyed. Food stores vanished in the flames, and whatever sacred objects remained within the settlement entered history's shadows. Did they burn alongside the town? Were they carried away before the attack? Hidden in nearby forests? Recovered later by survivors? No definitive answer exists. Military reports primarily focused on strategic concerns, rather than documenting ceremonial materials. Anything regarded as spiritually significant by the Shawnee may have appeared unimportant to soldiers unfamiliar with its meaning. Conversely, some sacred items could have been deliberately removed long before the settlement fell. Several oral traditions suggest that certain ceremonial objects were protected during periods of danger. This possibility aligns with practices documented among multiple indigenous nations. When communities faced conflict, sacred bundles often traveled with designated keepers rather than remaining inside vulnerable villages. If Tenskwatawa possessed important ceremonial objects, would his followers have abandoned them? It seems unlikely, yet historical certainty remains elusive. Adding another layer of mystery is Tenskwatawa's own later life. Following Tecumseh's death in 1813, the political influence of the movement declined significantly. Tenskwatawa continued living for decades afterward, eventually settling west of the Mississippi River before dying in 1836. During those years, what became of the ceremonial traditions he once led? Did sacred objects accompany him into exile? Were they entrusted to others? Or quietly returned to Shawnee communities beyond the attention of government officials? The historical record offers only scattered clues. Some 19th century accounts mention ceremonial bundles preserved among Shawnee families. Others describe spiritual leaders continuing traditions despite immense disruption. Few establish direct connections with Tenskwatawa himself. This silence has inspired countless theories. Treasure hunters have occasionally imagined lost relics buried beneath the former site of Prophetstown, waiting to be uncovered alongside forgotten foundations. Archaeologists, however, approach such claims cautiously. Extensive investigations have revealed artifacts related to daily life and the settlement itself, but no verified cache of prophetic relics has ever been discovered. Even if ceremonial objects once existed there, expecting them to remain buried in a single location oversimplifies indigenous traditions. Sacred objects were not static possessions. They moved with people. They participated in ceremonies. They remained part of living communities. Other theories suggest that descendants of Shawnee spiritual leaders may still preserve certain ceremonial items today. This possibility cannot be dismissed outright. Across North America, many indigenous nations continue safeguarding sacred objects within communities rather than placing them in public institutions. Importantly, such objects are not lost from the perspective of those entrusted with their care. They are simply not available for public viewing. This distinction matters. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes that mystery sometimes exists not because knowledge disappeared, but because it was intentionally protected. There are also stories, impossible to verify yet remarkably persistent, of unusual objects occasionally surfacing in private collections during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Carved staffs with uncertain origins, decorated medicine bundles lacking documentation, pipes attributed to famous leaders without reliable evidence. Collectors often assigned dramatic histories to artifacts in hopes of increasing their value. Separating authentic tradition from later invention has become extraordinarily difficult. Museums today face similar challenges. Without clear provenance, confidently identifying an object associated with Tenskwatawa remains nearly impossible. Another intriguing mystery involves the prophet himself. Historical accounts describe Tenskwatawa as receiving visions, interpreting dreams, and emphasizing spiritual transformation rather than material wealth. If sacred objects accompanied his ministry, were they viewed as powerful in themselves, or merely symbolic reminders of larger teachings? Anthropologists generally favor the second interpretation. Within many indigenous traditions, ceremonial objects derive meaning through relationships, prayers, and responsibilities, not supernatural properties residing within the materials alone. Yet, 19th century popular literature often portrayed native spiritual leaders through exoticized myths, suggesting magical relics or hidden powers. These portrayals reflected outside imaginations far more than indigenous beliefs. Even so, they contributed to enduring legends. Some local folklore claims that relics connected to the prophet bring unusual dreams to those who disturb them. Others speak of hidden caches protected not by physical traps, but by the understanding that only rightful caretakers could recognize their true purpose. Whether understood symbolically or literally, these stories emphasize an important idea. Sacred things cannot always be understood simply by possessing them. Meaning requires context. Without it, even the most significant object becomes only wood, stone, leather, or feather. Perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding Tenskwatawa's relics is not their location, but the history that disappeared alongside them. Imagine if a ceremonial bundle associated with the prophet were discovered tomorrow. Would historians immediately understand its significance? Almost certainly not. Without the accompanying songs, prayers, teachings, and responsibilities passed through generations, much of its deepest meaning would remain inaccessible. The object alone could never tell the entire story. That realization has increasingly shaped modern collaborations between archaeologists and indigenous communities. Material evidence matters, but living knowledge matters equally, sometimes even more. Today, Shawnee cultural preservation efforts continue protecting language, ceremonies, and historical memory despite centuries of displacement and hardship. These ongoing traditions remind us that history survives not only through artifacts recovered from the ground, but through communities that continue carrying inherited knowledge into the present. Even so, questions remain suspended between history and memory. Were sacred objects carried safely away from Prophetstown before its destruction? Did Tenskwatawa entrust them to future generations, whose identities remain respectfully private? Were some lost forever during years of conflict? Or have historians simply been searching in the wrong places all along? As evening settles over the forests where Prophetstown once stood, mist rises gently from the rivers that shaped so much of Shawnee history. Birds call from distant trees, and beneath layers of soil lie the quiet traces of a community that briefly became the spiritual center of a remarkable movement. Somewhere beyond the reach of written history, the answers may still endure, not necessarily hidden beneath the earth, but preserved within memories, traditions, and responsibilities that were never intended to belong to the wider world. And perhaps that is the most enduring mystery of all. Some relics are not truly lost. They are simply waiting for those who already understand what they mean.